In attendance are Director Jurgensen, Director Art, Director Carey, Director Bankus, Hafley, and Mayor Packham. Director Nelson is unexcused absent. Joining us is also Superintendent Gall at the table, and we have several of his team members here for support as needed. The first item on the topic is board and district communications, scope and discussion. This was something that was brought up a couple of weeks back, 2 or 3 weeks back. How do we proceed with the future board and district communications, and what are the pathways ahead? And Superintendent Gall talked about whether he can bring a scope in front of the board, and the board can also provide feedback on what are the expectations as far as what we want as far as this communication piece to look like going forward. I will briefly share some of my thoughts out here, and then walk around and get some of the board feedback too. I think board communications is a critical priority. Communications as such is a critical priority. It's been identified in several of the even end of the year superintendent's evaluation by the board as a critical component. In the past, when we have done district surveys, orgometric surveys, communications as such has scored at the lower level. So we have prioritized communications as something that is critical as part of our board priorities. And this is a continuation of that conversation. How do we convey the work of the board that the board conducts at the board dais to our citizens, to our community people, to our D11 community staff members and parents, all the good things that are happening in the district too? How do we convey that information? There is sometimes that gap in that communication. When I was talking to Vice President Hafley, she talked about she comes directly from a classroom, how even as a classroom teacher, even though in the past 2 years we have prioritized sending out periodic newsletters, that communication doesn't sometimes reach to the staff level. And teachers are busy with all the things that are on their plate, and primarily their job is to provide instruction, high quality instruction to their students, and having one more newsletter, which is often 2 pages or 3 pages, and having them to read through it, it doesn't trickle down to them. Would that be a accurate representation of?
It is.
Yeah. So we have been, when you look at our priorities, we have been student-centered, staff-focused. We have been parent also, part of the component. All of those things are something the board critically established as a priority. And I think in the past couple of years, the previous board that was in place, a lot of the changes that were implemented were to support our staff. So I think from my perspective, where I sit on the board dais, and also the collective board feedback would be that we have been pro-staff. But I went through a recent election process, and when you go through that recent election process, the feedback that we get during that process is that the board is not supportive of our staff. The message that is put out there is contrary to what I think the work of the board has been over the last couple of years. We have provided the highest starting pay for our teachers. We have provided excellent health benefits, better than what it was previously, but all that information doesn't trickle down to the staff level. And sometimes I know that part of it is the agenda that goes with the election season, where they want to categorize the board in a certain way, in a negative manner, or the district in a certain way, to suit personal agendas out there. But there is a need, from what I'm stating, is there is a need for us to communicate the work of the board and the district in a proactive manner, in a transparent manner to our community, in a timely manner too. The board communications, so there are 2 new board members joining us at this time. What the board communications has looked like over the past couple of years. Prior to 2 years back, at this time, there was no board communications. When the board 2 years took that role, that's when that board communication newsletter started. Prior to that, I'm not aware of the time that I've spent on at the district level that was targeted board communication itself coming from the board directly to our community. That started 2 years back as a priority, that we would make that a priority and communicate. And most of that work has been on the board itself, and the board trying to craft that communication piece, and then 7 components, 7 board members providing, the 6 other board members also providing feedback to that, and then some of the resources and the help at the communication team level, we utilize that. So that process itself ended up taking 2 weeks by the time the board communication starts, and by the time the newsletter starts, and by the time it goes out to the community, there is almost a 2-week gap. How is it that we can be a little bit more proactive and timely and send that information out? If we have a board meeting on Wednesday, can we send out something to communicate the critical components of what took place at the board meeting? 2 days later, by Friday, to our community, we approved a mill levy certification right there at the board dais. How do we communicate that to our community, not only our D11 community, to our broader community out there? Because there are only 30% of, I don't know, I'm just remembering stats, 25 or 30% of our D11 community that have students inside the district. There are people like Lyman that don't have students in our district. We need to communicate what we, approved as far as property taxes go to that community too. So from all that level, I think there is a need for communication, but that's the conversation here. What does that look like going forth? Do we need help and support from outside to help us through that communication process? I think there was a need for that after going through employee group negotiations last year, and we were not proactive in our communications during that point in time. And that's what happened, in us reaching out for an outside contract to help us with that communication. But that was construed as the board looking out for its own self-interest, but that was not the case. That was just to improve the communication that happened from the board level or the district level. But we will have that conversation right now and see what feedback that we want to give to the superintendent as far as that goes. What is it that we can expect as far as that communication goes? With that, I am going to open up and see if there is any feedback that you guys want to provide the superintendent as we go about this process. Superintendent Gall has already, communicated to the board that this is not something that communicating at that level. What does that mill levy certification looks like, and to the community? That's not something that you have the capacity, or the district has that capacity.
It is proven to be outside of our area of expertise to get that direct level of messaging of how do we connect. Let's just say the MLO certification was a contract. We have a tendency to still communicate things and say contract 005-626 was approved after an RFP versus sole source to the tune of $3.1 million, instead of saying we just created a new pathway to student success. And so I think getting some external supports for the board to get the messaging on those board priorities will allow us to get to the space where we are seen as being a single team governing towards a common set of goals, instead of still a series of individual positions pulled apart by one political strain or another.
Okay. Any thoughts or comments from the board at this point?
I have a question. What is the plan for the district at this point in time? I guess I want to know how this would be part of a cohesive communications plan, and I think we've been in the dark since November about what our communications office looks like.
So we no longer have a communications office. We have a D11 engagement office, which reports to the office of the superintendent. I believe I shared those slides during an executive session. Right, of which I do see this as complementary work that would certainly partner with myself as the D11 engagement sits underneath my office.
Okay, so we don't have a public information officer per se.
We do not have an individual position for a public information officer right now. We could certainly consider this as part of the scope of work. Right now, it hasn't proven to be a necessity to have an individual for that position. We've been able to overcome the challenges over the last 60 days without it, or I guess 35 days or so, 40 days.
But that may be an internal conversation with your team, and you may want to come back to the board at some point.
I think they're separate from this conversation. I think they could be inclusive if we were to find that level of scope that we wanted to write. But I think the question that you're here to discuss is there a need for a board communications strategy?
Yeah. So to answer your question, we still need to figure out, is there going to be a board communication strategy going forward? And both of these things are running parallel, and the district will figure that out. And at some point in time, Superintendent Gall and Ms. Weiss will also come and let us know how that process is working out, as far as there are going to be emergencies that come up at a school level on an ongoing basis. So we do need that point of contact, at least in the district level, who is going to disseminate that information to the media when that happens. And whether that is going to be a Dr. Weiss or somebody on her team, or you are going to figure out who that is going to be, that can be a parallel conversation. But this conversation is more about, do we as a board need some help messaging and reaching out to our D11 community, and how does that look like? And part of that board communications is also going to be helping the district out when we have good programs that are taking place. When we have the opening of Doherty or Coronado Fields, that is a district initiative, or the D11 promise. We still need to be able to communicate that to our community, the broader community, not just the D11 community, but the broader community, that these are what are taking place. Whether that is going to be newsletters, whether that is going to be help with strategic news articles that talk about positive things that are happening in the district, where we are put into contact with media that is providing support for the board itself in talking to the media, and how it is that we are better prepared to handle some of the issues that may come up in future. How are we better prepared to handle those issues in front of the media? Those are all topics that we may need assistance with. So go ahead, Director Jefferson.
Yeah, just as we were chatting here, I thought, what is this coming down to as far as goals go? What would be the goals of having an external communication team on top of our D11 Engage? And everything that I do in my business, I want a metric. So I know if I'm paying $2,000 for a program, that's marketing, am I getting a return on my investment? And so when I look at, what are our goals? Is it awareness of, D11 within D11 and outside of D11? Community engagement and involvement? Is it our events? Is it, big sport events? Is it we're hosting a semifinals for the, whatever sport at our new field? The impacts of, are we communicating impacts of board work to the community? Here's this decision impacted this, and here's how it affects you as the homeowner, the renter, the parent, the business owner. How do we measure the success? What metrics are we going to use to say, if we pay this much money for the program, what's our yield, and is it more kids coming back? Is it, oh wow, D11's got it going on, and it's stuff we've been doing all the time. It's our great CTE programs. It's all the things we've already been doing, but we're just marketing in a way that we're getting people to come back to D11. How are we measuring it? So, and that might all fall in the scope of work, but I don't mind spending money. I spend the majority of my budget on my business is marketing to make sure that I'm reaching people that I can potentially help. So I don't mind doing that for D11. I just want to make sure that we've got that scope of work, that we're really going to dial in what that looks like. Is it multimedia? Is it multilingual? Is it we've got a growing population of folks who don't just speak just English and Spanish. We've got 60 different languages now in our schools with refugees and sort of people coming in. How are we reaching and supporting them? So it's going to be a pretty big scope of work, but if we see the value of marketing ourselves well, things that get marketed get attention, and attention gives business. In this case, it's pupils in our schools, so.
Go ahead.
Can I ask a question of how, when I think of the current engagement team for District 11, is there a good way to summarize kind of what their sphere of responsibility is? Because when I'm thinking of the need for, whether or not the board needs a communication team, board work itself jumps out at me as, a facet which it would surprise me if your team had any responsibility for doing anything about it all. So if we have a mill levy certification or some policy that we're working on as a board, that seems like one place where it's just flat out not the responsibility of your team to message that. Another place that I'd be curious to hear about is just sort of meta facts about the district itself. So if we have, enrollment numbers, and enrollment numbers, as we also talked about in the election cycle, are kind of complicated. You have the numbers that you are projecting to see, you have the enrollment that you actually get, charter schools play a role in that. Is unpacking that kind of a topic within the purview of the engagement team, or is the engagement team more about, publicizing achievements of the schools themselves or the teachers themselves, or here's when our next sports game is? Like, can you help me understand what is the current sphere of responsibility?
There's probably no direct answer. I would say I think the difference in the line is what I direct the engagement team to be done is usually in delivery of what the board asks the superintendent to do. As the sole employee of the Board of Education, you all make direction for us to move in a certain way. When you all are trying to communicate as a governance team of a direction that the board is moving, then that's kind of that line of embarkation of my team doesn't really have the authority to do that. I could redirect them to do that. But President Malpacum probably went into a much deeper explanation of what the mill levy override certification means than we ever would have picked up. Because he sees that as an angle that's important for this board to be communicating to the constituents that voted it in on their responsibility on fiscal responsibilities and taxation for the public. That's not really in my wheelhouse. I have the budget that I have. We asked for that, where Brandon Govey's right there. We asked for that in good faith because we think it's the right thing to do. Communicating that as a broad strategy of this is a fiscally conservative board, but that will make the right strategic investments for kids. That's a board message. Mm-hmm. What some of those individual investments are that we want to sing the praises of I think then becomes the district's message. They're obviously nested, but right now there's been a large gap in, there hasn't been a consistent message from the board on what is the direction of the board. The board priorities still stand, but they haven't been modified by the new board. Will they be modified by the new board? I don't know that. It's not mine to recommend to the board that they should or they shouldn't be. The metrics that were put forth don't connect and nest underneath those board priorities. They actually built up off of the internal metrics that we designed to get the achievements that we wanted for kids in schools.
Yeah,
Ours is mostly operational and tactical,
right.
where I would believe yours would be more strategic if I were to use that ends, ways, and means type of model.
Yeah, I think to my mind, the question would be, number one, are there, to use your words, strategic things the board wants to communicate that are not really the responsibility of the current district engagement team? And it sounds like there are. Number two, is that work that the board is capable of kind of doing just in-house? And my guess to that would be no. I know that I certainly would not be capable of taking on an ask myself. And then number three would be, okay, if we do have this need, and if we can't just do it among the seven of us, what is our resourcing and what are the options for making that happen specifically?
So we have tried as best as we can in the last 2 years, as far as looking at what we have done in the past, to get that communication from the board level, the strategy and what is it that we are doing, the communication that takes place from the board dais, the decisions that we take. We try to communicate that through the newsletter, but that is mostly at the discretion and the time that we collectively find as a board. Sometimes they go out once in 2 months or once in 3 months. It's not being timely. It just is time consuming for us to do that at that level. I've tried as best as we can that first year, but it's gotten a little bit more sporadic when our time is put aside, when our time has to be dedicated to so many other things. I think there is value in sending something out as quickly and as timely as possible, and that's where we lack that capacity. Thomas, back.
I was just gonna say, and the newsletter is mostly put together by you, right? In addition to all your other duties as president.
That's what has happened in the
Yeah.
past. I have done that all, mostly I've taken on that responsibility, and then when time allows, I take send it to the entire board and get their feedback before it goes out. So that's when I say, when I start writing and composing that newsletter, and by the time that newsletter goes out, after going through all the various feedbacks that come from the board itself and also sometimes from the district level chiefs, so that we make sure that all that information is as accurate as possible, and then that translating into the format that it goes out in, where Jessica's team helps us out, it ends up being a 2-week window sometimes. By the time I start that newsletter and by the time it goes out, it's about 2 weeks before that happens. And things happen sometimes at a rapid scale that we want to communicate that in a timely manner, and we seem to be a step behind in that communication all the time. So that's the discussion that we are having right now. How can we be more timely in our communication? How can we be more effective in our communication? And the feedback that we get from Vice President Hafley was that we did make a good attempt in it. I think there is value in it. When we sent that newsletter out, we get some statistics out there. It shows that almost 20,000 people open it, at least. How many of them actually read the whole document? I don't have that information yet. But is there other ways that we can communicate, not just by that newsletter itself, but short communications that go, like a video clip that goes out, 30-second video clip. A teacher might have more time to look at that video clip on one aspect of messaging as opposed to we talking about all these things. And that's the level of help that we don't have at this time. And does that value add for the board at all, or are we comfortable just doing business as we have done before, or is it communication?
I think the other audience to add, based upon the really strong feedback that we got from the students who attended CASB, as well as the student from Doherty that shadowed you, was that we're missing an audience of the board doesn't speak directly to students, and we're trying to foster ways that the board will be listening more directly from students. But I think that should be a give and take both ways. And the method of which we're communicating right now is very adult centric. Students aren't going to read newsletters.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that. I remember the conversation Director Art and I had during breakfast with those students, and we talked about that newsletter out there because they said to us, those students basically said to us, what you guys do at the board dais, we never know what is going on. And we said, hey, we put out those newsletters. They said they know get that newsletter. So the newsletters aren't going to students, so they're not reading it. So that they have an interest in some of the things that are transpiring at the board dais, especially high school students, because it directly impacts them. And how is it that we communicate to that demographic of students out there what we are doing? So first, if we can have a consensus from the board, if this is a priority and we should pursue something in that direction, if we can have a conversation regarding that, and if the board can provide some feedback, then we can resource the superintendent to develop a scope based on the conversation that has taken place, and then figure out how to send out an RFP like we have done with prior contracts and hire the best possible for that.
So I have some questions. Are we talking about a year-round contract?
That would be essentially what we would need for the board communications.
And then would that person then be required to come to board meetings and take notes? And
Either come to board meetings, I will quickly answer it. Either come to board meetings or at least have to watch it virtually.
Oh, yeah, okay, attend the meetings. And then are we asking that our board newsletter go out after every board meeting.
No, I think they can still help us craft a monthly newsletter that sends out about all the information. Maybe important piece of information that happened that week, it could be the Mitchell Promise. I'm just saying that. If Mitchell Promise wasn't, we don't wait till the end of the month to communicate that. That Mitchell Promise is a small letter that we have put together in the past that can be communicated to the D11 community.
So a
as
monthly newsletter, but if there's something that is of interest, it would come out more often. And then to try and reach high school kids, are we talking about short video?
Yeah, probably, those are the things that communications, whoever the firm that we hire, if we say to them,
Well,
That
that's
we
why
need-
I'm asking, what are we gonna ask to define the scope of the work that they're gonna do?
Well, what we need to-
Question.
what we need to communicate to them is we do want to reach out to our students, we do want to reach out to our staff through creative means rather than the traditional newsletter ways, and then let them bring to the table what are the various options that they can help to reach us. I would assume that they are the experts.
I think we write the scope vague enough that says there are multiple audiences, students, staff, and community, looking for multimedial ways to reach them. And not say a monthly newsletter and 3 videos of board meeting, but let them come and tell us what are the ways that certain audiences digest information.
That sounds
Because
reasonable.
they'll have all the fresh data on how people are consuming content.
Exactly.
I would imagine the specific products we would want would vary pretty substantially week to week too, depending on what we're doing
Yep.
otherwise, so.
And that's why it's important to get a PR firm, since that's what they do. It's not something that we normally do, so they have that ability to, those ideas, it's bigger and broader than we would have.
And then the collaboration with D11 Engage, so that it's, going through our Facebook and our other platforms and things.
Right.
If it's a great video, we've got a lot of views here, but we wanna also double down on it. I'm looking at Jessica, double down on, our Facebook page or whatever it is, and we have that integration as well.
Yeah, this is going to be a joint work, even though it could be primarily helping the board with their communications. Any communications that we do as a board is on behalf of the district. So it is promoting the district's best interest too. So I think whoever we end up hiring as a outside contractor to help us out would have to work in conjunction with the district communications, and maybe it's a collaborative effort.
And that helps me clarify when you use the word integration. I don't wanna duplicate efforts.
Right.
So yeah, that integration, that communication with whoever's in engagement to
Yep.
broaden their scope as well.
I know that we had other communications contract. I know you had one for marketing to our surrounding school districts. I don't know if we can, somehow put all that communication contract into one contract and hire just one firm to do all of those things, or I don't know if all those are independent, that you would have to do them independently, the scope of the work is.
We can do an analysis to look at what parts of the scope are currently covered by other augmentation contracts to see if we think, I think the question you're really asking is the desirability to support this more inclusive by lumping multiple contracts together than a single person that's good at strategic communications and likes to watch board meetings. That's a different way to think about it. I'll have to look at what is the length of the current contracts that we are under, particularly for our marketing relationship. Because that's the largest one that we carry right now with the engagement team.
Okay. So the feedback that I get from the board, unless I am mistaken, and if I'm mistaken, please do speak up and provide that feedback to me, that there is value in this communication, then we are resourcing or asking the superintendent on behalf of the board to put out an RFP. Is that okay with the board as I'm talking? And if you disagree with me, please do say that. I'm trying to capture the message from the board here. Task the superintendent in putting out an RFP, and if necessary, we can, like we did with the previous contract, one of the board members serve on that RFP as, because this is for board communications too. So would that be okay?
Question, so an RFP gets written will we have the opportunity to examine the scope before it goes out? I guess that'd be one question, because I think that there's, I see value in communicating with our community and the broader community and all of its layers. However, the district, something like the Mitchell Promise, that is very much, the district should be walking that out the door the next day and the D11 Promise and saying, here's what we're offering. It's not necessary, and that could be a press release and press conference, et cetera, as it was. But for the board, it doesn't have to come from us necessarily as an extra communication. We can tie it into a monthly update or an every other week update. And I imagine that all of that's going to, the cost differential between every board meeting, I feel like we should maybe at the end of a board meeting instead take it upon ourselves to say, here are the things we want to communicate, rather than having somebody watch every board meeting, especially as long as they are. So, because we're paying them to do that, obviously, and then the work they have to do. And I'd rather say, between, exec cabinet and or the board, we just sit down and go, yep, this, that, and the other thing, these are our key issues. It also,
And then they craft the message.
and then they craft the message,
Sure.
yeah.
Great.
And they can go watch the targeted parts of the news, the board meeting, unless of course they're a D11, community member themselves and they wanna watch the whole thing. But, and all of that is going to, whether you're communicating 3 things and a video or 3 videos or whatever, I would be very interested in seeing how much that's gonna cost us.
Until we
We'll
put,
find out.
put out the scope.
Don't know until we ask.
So to Director Art's point, based on the message that took place out here, if you can put together a scope of contract out there, just a preliminary draft and then run it by the board so we can provide some feedback on that scope itself before it's put out.
Okay.
Okay.
Is the next work session okay to bring that scope to?
Right. Or you can send
Can you
it
send it
even
over
through
email?
email. Send
We'll
it
send
over.
it to email the Friday before the next work session, so we can then redline or comment on it at the work session.
Yep.
I'm just trying to get an action plan.
Yep. We can do that. Yeah, we can do that,
So we will share via email on the Friday before the next work session.
which would be January 17th is the next work session, so the Friday before that would be January 12th.
There you go.
So-
Human calendar.
So by that time, and that's 9-10 days away, and that will give you some time as an admin to work on that scope
Right.
and figure out what is it that, based on this conversation, is there anything else that you would like to communicate to the superintendent as far as what you want as the scope in that contract?
I was gonna start with, I don't know if this is part of the scope of the RFP or not, but I do think as a board, it's worth kind of thinking carefully the extent to which integration with the engagement team is correct, just in the sense that if we're justifying this by saying there's a series of board work and strategic things that are not really in the purview of their responsibility, that's why we need a communications team, then it feels weird to turn around and say, oh, and if we have this video that we like, we'll push it through Jessica's team. I'm not explaining myself very well, but it seems like if we're having a communications team to handle things that the engagement team is not appropriately tasked with, then it's not appropriate to funnel it through them either, necessarily. So that's just maybe something we've gotta be thoughtful about.
The problem's clear, we'll have a more complete analysis, but as I had said earlier, but we didn't say it in a public setting, the December 13th meeting had 124 viewers of the meeting after the meeting was over. And the average duration that they viewed the meeting was 8 minutes and 54 seconds, which was probably a 3.5 or a 4-hour meeting. And there were 58 people who watched it live, but most of them fell off after 6 o'clock. So we normally start at 5:30 to 6, which means those are people who were here to watch, I believe 12:13 was the unified sports that we were celebrating. And so the work of the board meetings and the work session exist for the Board of Education to get work done that drives the district. The administration supports that work. That's our job. That's why we're here. That's why there are people on the lines here. We're here for these meeting structures. Those meeting structure outcomes don't resonate beyond the very small group of very interested community members that we have. And so, and again, I will use as an example, during the election, people took every time I talked about Palmer High School and building a new Palmer High School downtown into the superintendent's going to bulldoze Palmer High School. That's how disconnected people are from what we actually talk about in these meetings. And there's nobody in any of these meetings who believed that the goal was to close and bulldoze Palmer High School. But the lack of our ability to translate the work of which we communicated into future vision setting and action plans is the gap that we're trying to fill.
Yeah, let me try to be more clear with what I'm saying. I'm not arguing against the need for it. I'm saying we need to be thoughtful about the way that if the board picks a team, the way in which they engage with Jessica's team. That's all I'm saying.
Right.
I was in that forum, so I get it.
And you happen to be the person who watched the work session who said, no, actually, what the superintendent and the previous board was agreeing to was something completely different.
Yeah.
Which is unfortunate that community members just bite off on the first soundbite that they are fed, and we're not feeding them a soundbite. Right, so that's just a huge missed opportunity.
Okay.
I got a thumbs up, ready to go.
Yeah, so bring it back to us. What I'm hearing is there is a value in communicating our shared goals, our outcomes, our priorities, so that we are clear about our messaging. As to Director Ott's point, the Mitchell Promise could very well be communicated by the district. But there are, as we go through budget negotiations and budget discussions going forth, a lot of it would be board decisions that are being made as to why certain things are being approved in the budget cycle and certain things aren't. And that is a board lift that we need to communicate to our public as to why certain decisions were being made and how that looks like. So bring it back to us based on this conversation. Town hall meetings is another thing that we may have to have going forward, whether that is board town hall meetings where we go and engage with the community as we have done in the past, or it could be related to the $120 million COP conversation that may happen, and we want community feedback on that, how we are going to spend that money, whether $60 million or $70 million investment in Palmer, what it looks like. And all this we can have help from this outside group helping us through those type of discussions. Okay, anything else?
Yeah, just the town hall meeting, that was something in my notes from when we were doing the retreat and we never got to it. I think we absolutely should schedule some town halls, and I don't think we need an outside group to help us with that necessarily. I mean,
No,
maybe,
not-
but that also comes with staff support and scheduling, and I think you brought it up, and I'm like, yes, we need to do that again.
Well, that is part of our board priorities itself, that we
Yes.
have at least one town hall meeting. I think we talk about one town hall meeting a year. That's how
when
we
the
have done it.
superintendent was having 3, I think.
Yeah, the
So-
superintendent has done it.
I am not planning on,
Yeah.
the return on investment from my perspective was very poorly attended. And they were literally the same people in 3 or 4 different sessions.
It's the same thing, when we have scheduled it, we have only 20 people in attendance, but at least
Maybe, but
we have made the effort to have a
Yes.
town hall meeting. We will, with all the time constraints, I don't know, we can have multiple town hall meetings for the board. There is also a possibility that instead of stretching the board time to attend multiple town hall meetings, if we can divide and conquer and send 2 members of our board, I'm just pointing at the 2 of you because you are
Yeah.
sitting in front of it, we'll just say, hey, you 2 go represent the Coronado thing, have a town hall meeting there. The expectation is not for all the board to show up, just for the 2 of you to show up and speak on behalf of the board. And you 2 go to the Doherty one and you 2 go to the Palmer one, whatever it is. So that way we divide and conquer and have multiple town hall meetings. And that will also give board members to individually talk. When 7 board members are present at a town hall meeting, each one of us want to take time to talk, and by the time it runs out. So maybe that's, if that the board is open to, we can divide and conquer and send 2 board members to each, divide the district in 4 quadrants, and each quadrant, a couple of board members. Okay, is that something that the board is agreeable to?
yeah, I suppose, let's start those conversations.
Okay,
Thank you.
And we don't need help from them. I'm just talking about the messaging part of it. Sometimes if an outside group is going to clearly come and say, hey, this is a messaging based on their research data or whatever it is that will resonate with our group, then we can ensure that we talk in the language that sometimes that we may not be adequately aware of. Communications team asks us to talk in a certain way. But
I'm not
Super-
sure about what you just said about an outside team. We can do it ourselves. I'm not sure what that means.
I'm just talking about this RFP that is going out and we are hiring
I thought
somebody.
we were talking about the format for the town hall.
Yeah, I'm just saying, even for, before we as a board go and talk to the town hall and have those town hall meetings, if we have somebody that is going to provide us communications help behind the scenes, that is going to help us with board communications, it may be worth it, and this is just a board conversation, that we ask for specific messaging that will resonate when we talk to the community out there at the town hall meetings.
Well, I want to make sure that we take into consideration that the last one went so well with having an outside moderator, and most town halls have someone from outside, that we follow that same format. It went very smoothly, and I think it takes the pressure off the board in the sense that they're not playing a dual role in trying to moderate and respond to questions that are coming to the board.
Okay,
You're, in short, you want talking points.
that's all right.
Yeah.
Talking points that will resonate with the community, and sometimes they, as an outside, specifically an outside marketing group and stuff, can provide us that. Moving on, you got the feedback that you need for this.
Yes, sir.
The next item on the agenda is the legislative agenda, and if you can pull up that 2-page document out there that we have used in the past as a legislative agenda. So this is something that the prior board has worked on, and at this time of the year, we usually end up adopting a legislative agenda, and this is required by policy too. So this is a 2-page document that previous boards have adopted. We just have to look and see if this current board has any feedback to provide to that document. Is there something that is relevant at this point in time that has to be addressed in there, that needs to be revised? I will start by saying, it talks about key facts about the impact of legislation on K-12 public education. I would change everywhere where it says K-12 to pre-K to 12, because that's the direction that,
Pre-K to 14.
well, I know, but I don't know if,
I think it's interesting if there's legislative agendas on better funding for community colleges that directly impacts the promise scholarships
okay,
and or other certification pathways in the workforce, we would want to be privy to understanding what that direction is going to be.
okay. If that is cut, I'm just throwing that we need to change some of that language to reflect what the current interest of the board is. This is, so one of that would be changing that K-12 to pre-K to 14, if that is what the collective will of the board is, and anything else that is there on that document. This is what we use as a legislative agenda when we are communicating with our state legislators, and when other people in our district level communicate with them too. This is kind of the direction that we provide them, that we want to advocate for these things on this agenda. So it's a 2-page document. Like I said, the first thing that I would like to change, if the board is comfortable with it, is change everywhere that it says K-12 to pre-K to 14. Would that be something that you guys are agreeable to?
Yes.
Okay, so
Okay.
You might need an asterisk explaining that at the bottom, like saying, hey, we're thinking differently in the 11. So they go PK to 14.
Yeah.
You have a little asterisk, so hey, this is what we're thinking.
Okay, maybe your team can put something for that asterisk.
I can do that.
Yeah, and then scroll down that. You've had time to look at this. Hopefully you have anything else that you would suggest in that first page that you would change.
The 900,000, we just need to make sure that's accurate, today. And if we're gonna say pre-K to 14, then it's probably gonna change,
Yeah.
even with the declining enrollment across the state.
Yeah.
So,
You know, one of the presentations that I listened to when I was at that GASP conference, it talked about nearly 1 million students that we serve in
Nice.
public education in
Maybe you
grades.
say that.
Yeah, we just say, you know, close to or nearly 1 million students. Okay, are you comfortable changing that to nearly 1 million students? And then anything else that you would want changed in that first page?
Probably not that goes on here, but, you know, the previous board and this board still continues to talk about funding. Is there anything we could put in here that says, you know, we would appreciate judicious bill passing that doesn't create further state programs and state offices?
I think that may be there in the second
the last
page.
bullet on the next page.
Yeah, so let's look at this, if we are comfortable with, I think Melissa, you're capturing some of these changes that we are talking about. One, we talked about pre-K to 14 and almost 1 million students. That's all the changes we talked about in this. If we can move on to any other changes on this page that the board wants to make. If not, let's move to the second page. Oh, going back to the first page again, just quickly, I want to do, because there was one thing change, it was this. The second bullet point, the third line states, while state funding to K-12 education continues to be limited. I don't know how true that is after the last year when they have significantly increased funding to K-12 education. We still haven't completely eliminated the budget stabilization factor. I think that is the plan that this year that the legislature is going to consider that, completely eliminated. So, Director Rod, do you have a better idea? Is this wording out there truly reflects where state funding is at this point in time?
I would leave it, the funding, even if the budget stabilization factor is eliminated, we are like funding for 1998 or something, and it's like, yay, we're not even up to 2000 funding where we should be. If it hadn't been eliminated, how much did the legislature essentially owes public education in Colorado? And, in a way, it's, by definition, it's not unlimited, so it is limited. So you could argue that.
Can we
Just-
possibly change that limited to continues to be a challenge?
If you like.
Okay.
I think that's fair too.
Okay, so capture that continues to be a challenge. Moving on to the second page. So these are specific stance that we are taking on certain things, improving schools and student achievement, school district resources. This is what previous board has done. Any revisions or changes that you want to make to any one of those bullet points up there?
I would add one, or see if it fits in the first bullet point maybe, around protecting the choices and decisions of parents and guardians over their students. Back when we were first elected, we went through a couple of bills in the State House on, requiring vaccinations and, usurping parent rights and their choice for other things in that regard, and then creating a separate system where they logged you in and basically forced you into taking this class to say, oh, this is why you should vaccinate. And it just was a whole big mess of, government overreach into parents' choices on their children. So if it's, something in there that just says, supporting legislation that encourages effective family-school partnerships and protects the parent or guardian's right to raise their child in certain decision-making, I don't know. But it's just, there were bills last year on stuff that added other things that affect minors without parents, notification there. So we've seen legislation being passed that does not include parents in the decision-making process. If it's mental health issues, if it's, different, sexual orientation stuff, counseling, There's just things that are not supporting parents in the space. And if we could have something in there about that, I would appreciate it.
Thoughts or feedback from the rest of the board?
I would argue that vaccinations and what we do as a board, those aren't necessarily connected. So we are interested in the family-school partnership about education and parent rights for, we shouldn't be spending our precious lobbying dollars, is partly what it comes down to, arguing for or against vaccination.
And that was one example. It was more of just of keeping a choice of a parent to say, this is what I wanna do, and that's the end of it. Versus, oh, well, if that's what you wanna do, you've gotta go do these other classes and sign up for this system and run your documents through here, and then that's what you report to the schools. It was just an extra hoop for people saying, this is the choice for my family.
You're saying keep the government out of the family unit.
Yes, and as it relates to, now you've gotta go through this system, and that's the paper you turn into the schools to say, I'm doing an alternative vaccine schedule, or I'm choosing this religious exemption, but I had to hop through this state hoop because of this bill that got passed. So somewhere in the way of, I'm not saying, hey, we're not nitpicking issues, but it's saying, if you're making legislation that's causing it harder for parents to raise their kids that then go to public schools, we should be protecting and trying to advocate for parents to say, they're the first teacher of these kids. They're delegating their responsibility to us in the school system, and we should honor that responsibility that they get. That's more of, if that helps clarify maybe.
Would it be fair to, you can let me know if this is a fair summary of both of your positions or not. Would it be fair to try to summarize this as, we don't want the legislator, we don't want any of this stuff routed through public schools? That we don't want expectations levied on the public school system, that we be the one to mediate these kinds of decisions?
I think that's part of it. I think that's part of it. And that kind of goes to the unfunded mandates piece where, now we've got school nurses figuring out how to run through this whole extra system of immunization records and waivers and all that. So that's one example, a recent example. So.
I just don't see it as part of what we should be lobbying on, that's all. So we just disagree on that.
Okay. Is there any specific language itself that you can propose, Jason or Thomas, you also trying to bridge the gap between what Director Art looks at it, or
I think at the end of the bullet point, while honoring a parent's or guardian's right to raise their student how they deem fit.
Yeah.
With limited government interference, something like that.
Yeah, I think policy AKB, that parent partnership policy that the board adopted, has language, some of the language already in there. I'm just looking at that policy right now. It says the board values the parent guardian as the constant and primary influence in a child's life and recognizes that parents are responsible for determining the upbringing, education, care, and moral development of their child.
Yeah, maybe throw that in there.
Yeah.
Throw that whole point in there.
Well, I don't know we need to throw the whole of it. We can say supports legislation that encourages effective family-school partnership and recognizes parents as an integral part of the education and moral development of their child or something like that.
Sure.
Is that something that the board, we can, if you can look at the language in AKB, okay, and see if you can put something in there. I think this is
In which one, KP?
AKB, that was the parent partnership policy that the board adopted last year. Something that would reflect in that it would essentially come to the board after that the board would have to adopt this from the board dais. So if you can put that language in there and before it gets posted on the board docs, before board can adopt it. Okay?
I'll just note one more thing, and that is, when we look at our Board of Education priorities, I understand that there's a strong interest in parent rights, and I think we also have to recognize that some people will keep government and school districts and teachers out of their kids' lives because they don't want to be reported for abuse and not feed their kids or, crazy things. But when I look at our Board of Education priorities, I think this should be reflective of that and the change, the positive change we want to see. And to me, that the vaccination thing, I understand that's just one example, but how does it come back and support our student achievement, our enrollment, and our resources? So we've got improving schools and student achievement. Parents should be an integral part of their students' education. Yes, but that, to me, that's summarized by effective family-school partnerships. School district resources, we talk about, not a little further down, the unfunded mandates, which you could argue is part of resources. We don't, it's just not part of our sphere in a way that is separate to me. So that's why I'm arguing so strongly. It's like, I think we can leave it out, because we are about the education, and I don't think we should lose sight of that in our priorities. So, I rest my case.
Has the board got any, I'm just trying to figure out a consensus here from the board. Director Jurgensen articulated one line of thought, Director Hart articulated another line. Is the board at this point in time want to take any stance on this, or do we leave it as it is right now? Where do the board land on it?
I'd like to go back and give some thought to the language in AKB. Not only on this board, but the previous board when I was attending. We seem to be speaking the same language, and that is a restriction on unfunded mandates that come down to school boards. And that we recognize that we as a board recognize that, again, that's been said around this table, that parents are the first teachers and we have children only for this amount of time, and hopefully parents will have their children for the rest of their lives, and I think we need to acknowledge that. And so I would like more time to go back to AKB and see if recognize is a strong enough word for the
So this has to be,
board I have.
perfect. This has to be adopted by the board from the board dais. Director Jurgensen, if you can pull some language from AKB to reflect your line of thought, it is just a proposal that you are bringing in front of the board. And the board at that point in time can decide if we want to adopt the revision that Director Jurgensen is bringing to the table. Instead of us trying to wordsmith out here, let Director Jurgensen bring that to the table, and we can say, hey, A or nay, we will adopt it without that language revision. Is that good? And we leave it at that. Okay. Supports legislation that provides for increased teacher quality and effectiveness. I don't have any change to that. Support the power of local school boards to align delivery of instruction in a manner that best serve students. I was thinking about that. The only revision that I would make is, instead of calling it power, supports the authority of local school boards. I don't think it changes anything. If that is okay with the board.
It's a stronger statement.
Yeah.
Authority is a stronger statement.
Okay, so can we make that change instead of power, authority? Supports policy targeted towards the consolidation and reduction of the fourth bullet point. Where do the current board stand on that? Are we for reduction of high stakes standardized testing in a movement towards focusing, monitoring, and improving the lifelong learning process? I don't know where the current board stands on this.
I personally am okay with it. A consolidation, yeah, that would be great. If we could, for example, provide the state with our own tests and say, this should be enough for you, that would be great. And we could save money on CMAS and losing all those days, just as an example.
Okay.
And the whole high stakes thing, I mean, if we have some desperate needs, again, conversation with the teacher today, we have some desperate needs in this district. But if people are really focused on trying to promote our students' well-being and academic success, I don't think that rating us necessarily as turnaround status on one test is ideal. we should be looking at some bigger and broader options. Just one point of view.
I fully support that. If I could piggyback on that, are you implying that D11 teachers would be the ones making up the tests that these kids are taking? Because we don't know who's making the state tests, we don't know who's grading the state tests.
That's very true.
All we know is that we're supposed to give it to them.
Well, and when we, some kids can look at a test, and I've run into this myself. I'm like, well, that's true, and that's true, but there's no way to explain your answer. And I think if you can argue your case with a district person or a staff person, maybe that's better. But yeah, there's no end all be all of the state.
Yeah.
So.
I'm concerned at the direction this is taking. We have a third of our kids who are reading on grade level. So right now, the challenge is not the couple of days that we test for CMAS. Our correlation between our interim assessment and CMAS is getting tighter, but it still isn't perfect. And our interim assessment says that 3/4 of our children are not on grade level.
Yeah.
And so we need constant feedback that reminds us of how far our children are from achievement. Now, I know that there is inequity in tests. I know that tests don't sometimes translate culturally, but we're talking about a perturbation or an anomaly in testing theory compared to walk into any fourth grade class and hand out a book and see who can read on grade level. And when only 20 to 30% of those kids can read on grade level, I promise you, testing is not the reason why they're not there. The quality of instruction in our classrooms is not meeting the need of our students. And the only recourse we have right now that reminds us of that is our constant poor performance on the state test. If we could do away with state testing, we will very quickly convince ourselves that our SH something else doesn't stink, that we're just fine. Because we've been just fine for 20 years, and we've lost a third of our student population while we've increased the population that we could drag from within the city. Because the quality of the instruction that we deliver is not as high as the quality of the instruction that is delivered in neighboring districts. That is the clearest conclusion of the data of achievement and enrollment over the last 20 years. Walking away from state testing and blaming this on high stakes testing is not it. I have yet to meet the child who fails the test, who completely blows the comprehensive demonstration of knowledge out of the water. It just doesn't exist. And when it does, again, it's a perturbation or anomaly. Most of our children are not at grade level because we don't hold ourselves to the standards of ensuring that they need to be at grade level. And that's the only measurement that the state has to compare an apple to an apple. Right now, most of the staff sends their kids to schools outside of the district of which they're employed in because they have the ability to choose. And so they choose the highest quality education for their students, which they know as educators isn't currently the very district that they teach in.
Yeah, so the board making a statement as far as whether we need to reduce or consolidate state testing, with the concerns that Superintendent Gall is bringing to the table, we got to have a reliable way in which students can demonstrate their learning at some point in time. And if we walk away from that, how are students going to, at the end of the year, demonstrate that? Whether that is internal assessments that are there, great. Then we got to make sure that internal assessments are going to be rigorous and figures out from the beginning of the year to the end of the year if we end up showing that improvement. I don't know if the board wants to take any stance on it. Maybe we can take that bullet point completely out. Then we are not taking a stance one way or the other on it. Would that be better reflection instead of us advocating for reduction of high stakes standardized testing and a movement towards focusing? And this, is that something, or the other thing that you have brought about, Superintendent Gall, are there other ways that we can have students demonstrate their learning other than standardized testing? Maybe we advocate for that, where it's a portfolio thing or whatever it is.
I'm just telling you that 1 million kids across the state, it's a pipe dream.
Okay.
It's a pipe dream to think that the state's ever gonna get their arms around portfolio by defense and competency-based demonstration of knowledge. It barely has enough staff at CDE to actually give the assistance to the local districts on what are the challenges they have that they need to be able to overcome. And so again, I get it that higher ed's moving away from SATs. But the kid who gets the 1200 or the 1400 on the SATs is the kid who gets the 3.8 or the 4.0 on the GPA. There are very few examples of the kid who has a 2.0 that would have scored high on the SATs or vice versa. This is the whole game on whether it's a yardstick or a meter, they're both about 3 feet tall. If you want to measure something with a micrometer and somebody hands you a yardstick or a meter, it's not whether it was a yard or a meter, it's the whole measurement is off. The challenge in public education right now is that kids aren't promoting from each grade level with a preponderance of learning objectives in their toolkit. They move, and the only way we have to measure that consistently across the state, really across the country, is through some form of standardized test. And I get it that they're high stakes, the rest of their life is high stakes. And so I think the better that we prepare the majority of our children to be able to meet these expectations, the better we prepare them for life.
I'll add another piece likely that the state would be thinking about is for public education accountability to the public, that you want to have the hard data to show to parents and families that their kids are being educated or that they're not being educated. I do think it's a separate question whether or not in the state of Colorado we are doing too much standardized testing. You mentioned in your experience you feel like there's too much of it. I don't teach at the high school level. By the time they get to me, they've taken a plethora of standardized tests, so I don't feel competent to weigh in on this one. It certainly seems possible to me that standardized testing would be a need and still to be overdoing on it. I don't know the answer to that question, and so in that sense, I don't have an opinion on that bullet point.
So the main thing that they test on is English language and math every single year at all grade levels. Science is only at certain grade levels in elementary school and middle school that they test. That's my understanding. And Brandon,
In high school, they take
you may
the SAT
correct
and
me.
the SAT.
And then social studies, last year legislation came out, I think that was adopted where they did away with the social studies test, at least that bill was proposed. I'm just trying to recollect. So already they have reduced the amount of testing that are taking place. It's only ELA and math that they test at the end of the school year at all grade levels. And then the SATs, PSATs, that's my understanding at least.
That's
So,
correct.
yeah, okay,
That's correct.
okay.
So there is no state mandated test in secondary, other than the state thinking years ago that the SAT would be a good bridge for them.
The SAT is
We
the
don't do a
state
CMAS.
secondary.
No, I don't think so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which already is much reduced over what many states do. Many states have a state mandated version of CMAS at the secondary level, and kids are then taking the SAT or the,
Yes,
I'm sorry,
PSAT
and the ACT.
and the ACT.
Because still probably 30 to 50% of the universities are expecting some level of standard-based aptitude test for entry.
So for this level of discussion up here, instead of trying to figure out the merits and the or the challenges of CMAS, do we as a board want to take a stance on this bullet number 4, or do we take it out completely? That's the question. Or do we want to revise that bullet in any way, shape, or form? Or do we leave it as it is, or do we take it out? Is there any thoughts on that at this time, or?
Well, in the classroom, I thought we did too much testing. But as the mom of a military mom, when we went from state to state, I like to have the information that showed me what to expect from the next school that we went to from state to state. And so I see a need for some standardized testing, so I'm ambivalent, I don't know.
So since we are ambivalent, that's what I'm saying. Instead of advocating for something and the board is ambivalent on it, why don't we just take it out? That way we are silent on that topic, as opposed to now taking a position that we are against standardized testing. If that is the will of the board and you are against standardized testing, then say it, or we can just take it out completely and we are at least silent. We are not advocating for it or against it.
I mean, the current language doesn't say eliminate standardized testing, the current language says consolidate and reduce.
Yeah.
And at least from the other teachers in the room, it seems to me like there is some voice in favor of consolidation and reduction, not elimination.
Okay.
So in that sense,
I
I'm
agree.
okay with leaving it in.
Okay, well, then we will leave it as it is and proceed. That's the thing. Support policy that provides equitable opportunities for all students and support legislation. Is that sixth bullet point still relevant at this point in time? Students disadvantaged by the pandemic? Okay,
Probably for
It
another,
would be hard.
the rest of the decade.
What, for the last one?
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah, I didn't know if we are 2 years removed from the pandemic. Are we still
Yeah.
Okay, great. Moving it down, school district resources, support a thorough, uniform, free public education. Okay, anything that you would like changed in that? The only thing that I would want to add out here, this was based on the feedback that we received last year, was that changes to the School Finance Act that is going to impact urban school district like ourselves. So something like a bullet point out there, I just wrote this, urges caution in modifying the School Finance Act in a manner that will negatively impact funding to urban school districts. So that is something that was on the table last year, that they were going to impact the funding to urban school district, take money away from urban school district to fund rural school districts. So we are saying, opposes whatever it is, if you are going to fund rural school districts by taking away money from urban school districts. What I put out here is urges caution in modifying the School Finance Act in a manner that will negatively impact funding to urban school district.
Yeah, sounds good.
Is that?
Well, except they'll start with supports, so I think you should work it out so that it can be in the language. Because urges, we
Okay.
don't wanna urge, we wanna
Okay,
act.
Yeah. Supports, but I'll work on it and bring that to the board. But something to reflect that sentiment, I would like to put out there.
I think you can
So,
modify
say
the second
opposes.
bullet, because the second bullet already addresses high risk. If you were to make high risk a socioeconomical component.
Yep.
Not just of special needs.
Yep.
You have academically challenged students, I think you could make the play for the concentration of kids farther behind is not linear, it's exponential in the investment that it takes to overcome. And so if you have 2 kids in your class that are behind and then you have 4 kids that are in class behind, you don't need just twice the amount of time, you need 3 times the amount of time, because now the preponderance of the class time is spent that way. So you don't want to see the SFA treated in a linear fashion between the needs of a student in a rural community that might actually be on grade level, but doesn't have the economy of scale that urban schools do. They're not apples to apples, they're apples to oranges.
Okay.
So I think if you take Director Ott's point of using it about supporting legislation and just calling out socioeconomical challenges that are represented by urban environments.
And the other thing that comes into factor, I think last year they were going to change the cost of living factor. A school district like Colorado Springs or Aspen get a little bit more funding because the cost of living in Colorado Springs or Aspen is going to be significantly more as opposed to living in Burlington, Colorado, or whatever it is, So they fund urban school districts with a different cost of living factor, so that teachers can be provided that compensation to live in a Aspen or Vail, and even in Colorado Springs or Denver. So we will try to address some of those things in that. Anything else that we need to change in that document itself?
Sorry. This feels a little nitpicky, but I don't like the idea of putting special needs and academic at-risk students in the same bullet point. Those are not resourced in the same way, meeting those challenges are not staffed in the same way. we want to increase resourcing for both. I wonder if separating them as factors would be worth doing, but I'm happy to be overruled on that.
If you can provide some language, if you can, propose some language that you can bring to the board, how you want to differentiate it, again, instead of trying to wordsmith it, if you can bring that language, then we can see if that is something that the board would Jason.
I emailed Melissa, point if you wanted to consider it now or consider it later, it's up to you.
Oh, okay. You emailed Melissa
Uh-huh.
something? Okay.
If she wanted to, but you can look at it later too.
Okay, can we move on to the bottom, Melissa? And unfunded mandates are covered in that part out there too. Okay. Jason, this you brought up previously at the very beginning. Is that language good enough?
Yeah, I mean, it's more just of, we talk about needing funding, but we expand and create all kinds of state programs every year that we then fund. And it's so how do you word, appreciate judicious funding of state programs in regards to how that impacts school funding,
Okay.
in addition to unfunded mandates. But it's more just a pet peeve of mine.
Okay.
We say we need more funding, but yet we're expanding all these state programs and task force and councils. Like all these things cost millions of dollars that could go to funding schools, but they're pet projects and other things, and then we go, wonder why I don't have money for schools.
Okay. I think refrain from unnecessary rules and legislation maybe captures that. If you have any other thoughts, provide. So you are going to provide some language. We talked about Thomas will provide some language. I will provide some language. So if we can bring all that collectively together by sometime early next week, if you can provide that feedback to me, then we can try to assemble all that together and then bring it in front of the board. Okay? The last thing that I want to discuss on this legislative agenda, again, this is a board conversation. We have had a lobbyist that comes and talks to the board, provides update on legislative bills that are in session and gives us updates. His name was Dylan Pepper. I think you were part of that RFP you were part of that group
I
that
think,
did.
well, I remember he was
Yeah.
my first choice.
Yeah.
And I have to say, at the conclusion of his serving his first term, I'm very impressed with the work that he turned out.
Okay. As I shared with the board at a prior board meeting, I think the contract with them is about $15,000. That's what we pay him to provide that service, give updates on legislative bills, come and talk to the board regularly. Is the board comfortable with using him again for this upcoming year? And this is, I don't want to,
I'd consider us not having a lobbyist.
what's that?
I would consider us not even having a lobbyist.
Okay.
If we wanna save that money.
If we don't have if we don't have a lobbyist, then the board may not get updates, regular updates. We would have to go and do our
I
own.
get updates in my email
Yeah.
from somebody about what's happening on the Capitol.
Yeah,
Don't
we
track
would
it or
have to
something.
kind of do our own
But
research in trying to find out which are the bills that have been introduced in the public education spheres that's going to impact us. We would not get that consolidated information as like a lobbyist coming in. If that is the will of the board, so be it, but right now we don't.
Or think outside the box, if D49 is paying 15 grand, we're paying 15 grand, D20 is paying 15 grand, D12, D38, we're all paying 15 grand just to get here's what's going on in education. Is there some sort of collaboration through your superintendent's, cohort, Mike, that you could,
Yeah.
hey,
Consolidate.
let's all pool in, we'll pay 30 grand, we'll all pitch in 7 and we'll get what we need. I don't know. I just,
My understanding, I already asked that question,
Okay.
Jason, based on that. There is a collaborative that exists right now, and I think D20, maybe D49 or security or D2 or
D3,
something,
sure.
maybe. But my understanding is that collaborative charges per student okay, that is there in the school district. And when they worked out that sum of money that we would have to pay, it ended up being more than $15,000. It's not like, hey, $130,000 this. And then if different school districts had different things that we want to advocate for, D20 or D49 wants to advocate for different things, then we are in a collective thing where we have to collectively agree that we are all going in the same direction. Our needs could be very different than what D2 wants to advocate. Okay.
So I also get the legislative updates, and the reason I support having a lobbyist is that when I read it on my email, if it raises questions, then when we have an actual person who has been attending and all, I can ask those questions and get some answers. And that's the difference between the two for
Okay.
me.
Sure.
If the board doesn't have strong opposition on it, I would recommend that we continue that lobbyist relationship for a year. And then at that end of this year, we
We can
figure out.
evaluate.
Evaluate if this is something that we want to. We have 1 year left on that contract. Instead of ending that arrangement, we can continue that. It's $15,000. That's all.
Will we use Dylan Pepper again?
What's that?
Would we use Dylan Pepper again?
Yep. And that's what we will be using at this point in time, unless the board wants to put out another RFP and go through that process.
I would maybe like some disclosures on other bills he's lobbying for that maybe go against some of our legislative agendas. There was an instance last year where that was the case, but it wasn't really brought up. And I won't bring it up here, but there's things that he's also helping with that goes against some of our legislative agenda, we would wanna know that. So just making sure that he's all in for what we need.
Okay.
I have,
Maybe
I have a related question. When I hear the word lobbyist, I'm thinking of in terms of what Jason said, someone who's going to go to the Capitol and lobby for your preferred positions. But it sounded like what Sandra was talking about was someone coming and making us aware of what was going on, rather than someone going there and arguing in favor of our positions. So to what extent did this person, as part of that $15,000, actually make arguments on our behalf, and to what extent were his job duties keeping us informed?
Yeah,
Great
it's the
question.
expectations are both. Okay, when he comes and informs us, we as a board can take a position on certain state bills and say, this bill we approve or we are in favor of, this bill we oppose. And if we say this bill we oppose, then his responsibility is to go and advocate on behalf of that board, lobby our legislators on behalf of this board to ensure that that doesn't, but whether he can be effective in getting that pushed through. The only thing that I can think about was last year at the end of the school year, there was a concerted push to change the School Finance Act to take money away from urban school districts and move it to rural school districts. And at that time, we collectively put together a letter and he used that letter as a central piece in getting other school districts that are going to be impacted to join in. And we were effective in not having that School Finance Act passed as it was being considered. So it's both. They are supposed to do both.
But we don't know if that was actually him, but we were in front of the information.
Yep.
And so we were crafting a message back up before we were forced to react to, I think it was a $14 million hit. So if my bet was pay $15,000 to avoid a $14 million hit, I would run that risk one more year.
So
Especially, anticipating that the SFA will not be as clean as it was last year. I think the governor has overstated in his budget what he thinks that will realize. And the pressures that we think that will exist in this next year's budget mean that we need to be on the front end of that, not reacting at the last minute.
And I saw we all saw the email that came out and said, these are the people who can go to the state capitol and speak on behalf of District 11. Is there any coordination between our lobbyist and the district so that we are in front of what's coming to the legislature while it's still in committee? And I don't know the answer to that question. I mean, there's a list like this that can speak on behalf of the district.
Right.
And it's our
most of the-
lobbyist who is our connection.
Yeah.
So
So are you asking, is there a communication between those people and the lobbyist at that point in time? I Brandon, do you have an answer to that? I mean, you're not in contact with the lobbyist at this point in time.
I've made brief contact to make sure that he was interested in continuing pending the board discussion. I know that he is still interested. I know 2 years ago, I don't remember who we had at that point, but we kind of managed a bill tracker between the lobbyist and the necessary chief or executive director so that there was a line of communication. I don't recall that last year, but I wasn't as heavily involved.
Greg, we had the bill tracker last year.
We do.
We did.
So can that process continue with the bill tracker and the chiefs to let them know that some of these bills could impact their individual departments in this way, kind of?
Yeah, we'll continue that. We did it last year, because I remember it coming through Greg's role when we were managing that. The question is whether or not we're gonna actively lobby for a position as a district, and I think that's just at the direction of the board, that I'm certain Dylan could be helpful in that, or we could determine what are the things that we wanna actually go actively lobby.
Okay, and like what Superintendent Gall was talking about, the School Finance Act, it could be a $15 million impact, and what we are paying the lobbyist is $15,000. So I think there is value in that, in getting that type of help. And I'm supportive of keeping the lobbyist for at least another 6 months so he can provide periodic information. And if the board is comfortable with it, let me know, and so we can move on to the next agenda. Are we comfortable going, and Dylan is interested in pursuing this? Okay, are we good? Good. Okay, that's discussed. Moving on to the policy discussion will come, and Greg X is here. One of the primary responsibilities of the board is policy work. Policy is the way the board sets the governance for the school district, and then the superintendent gets that directive through policies from the board. In talking with Dr. X and also some of the feedback that has come from the policy committee itself and board members too, is there a way that we can make this process a little bit more efficient and streamlined? Right now, there is not a specific policy by that, sometimes it seems like it takes 3 or 4 months by the time it goes to the policy committee and it's being adopted by the board. So Dr. X will quickly go through the current policy process. Maybe you can summarize it quickly and then see what way can we become more efficient at this with some boarding.
Absolutely. All right, well, good evening, members of the board, Superintendent Gall. Real quick, the board policy process is outlined in actually outlined in policy BG. And in that policy, which is our governing process, it talks about creating policies aligned to CASB, Colorado Association of School Boards. They use a unified national coding system, and that unified national coding system practiced obviously across the state, but has kind of some subcategories, which I'll get to in just a moment. Direction on regulations and overall implementation are actually in there as well. So once the board passes policy, the guidance is given to the superintendent and his team to enact regulation to enforce the policy. And then in red here I have, it creates 2 unique things that we don't have. Policy BG that we do have does align to CASB's version of it and other school districts locally, but we create 2 things. We have a 3-year review cycle, and we also have an advisory committee created by Policy BDF, that is the policy committee itself. There are 12 large sections of policy, from our foundations, which are our basic governing principles for the entire district, going all the way down to our educational agency relations. We have support services, we have instruction in there, we have students. So kind of each division of work, I guess is the best way to look at it, has its own category of policy, and then within that there are subcategories. So here I use an example just because I'm very familiar with it, the JH and the JI series. And in our district, we take the JH and the JI series, which are student attendance and behavior, and we block those out to a point of contact. In that case, it would be the director of our student support office. He's responsible for the update and the review and for bringing revisions forward. This is the actual policy workflow. So if we go back and we look at attendance and behavior, there may come a time when legislation is passed where one of those policies, one of this whole series needs revision. So it's brought forth to the policy committee, that's in the middle channel. The policy committee reviews it, they decide if the revisions that were presented work for the committee, they vote. If it's passed, it moves on to the board in this case, where we introduce it as a non-action item. At the policy committee, there can be review over context, there can be a request that further action be taken by that policy, at that point of contact for that policy. It can be returned back. So in the case of attendance and behavior, it would go back to the discipline committee to be reviewed, to be redrafted, and then brought back to the policy committee. Once it's brought on, it moves to the board for non-action, where it then goes to discussion at the dais. The board can take action to return it back to the policy committee. If the policy committee feels that they don't have enough information, they can push it back to the policy owner and policy point of contacts work to get further clarification, and then it goes back through that process again. So there is an average of about 2.5 months for a revision to get through committee and to the board, so for non-action. So a couple of opportunities and some challenges we've run into. We have had some slow push this year. And part of that was we ran into some requests from the committee for further guidance from the board on their governance and what they really want to see inside of policy. I do think that the previous board took a lot of interest in policy, which was really good, and it attended a lot of meetings. So a potential reverse of the flow is an opportunity, and what I mean by that is our policy system tends to flow bottom up. So if we take guidance and principle from board and move that into the committee and let the committee use that guidance, that would help inform the decisions that are made at the committee and would keep us from bringing forward policies that we pretty much know already don't align to the principles of the board, because they are yours. The review cycle, sometimes we get caught in this trap, and I go back to that example I gave you, the JIJH. When you have legal changes you have to make that have to be implemented because state law dictates that, your whole series is then out of the 3-year revision cycle because you have to revise it. So then it puts that one on a revision. So in the case of Mr. Brandt, we will see Mr. Brandt maybe 2 times a year, Director Brandt, because he'll have some policies that are on cycle, he'll have some policies that he's reviewing, he'll have some policies that he has to make a change for. So when we go in front of the board, sometimes you'll see we'll have policies on attendance and behavior. We'll have 2 of them, and then right after that, I'll introduce a policy on pets in school. So they're not coming forward in group, in block. So there's an opportunity there, I think, for us to work on larger topic-based by the point of contact, for us to work on bigger chunks of policy at one time so we can get them revised, aligned, and then get them appropriate to coding standards. And then revise when we need them. So if a point of contact has 3 of their policies out of 6, they review all of their policies annually anyway. But we do have a provision where we have to bring it forward for review. The committee has to sign off on the review, and if they review it, then it's counted as reviewed. So those are some of the challenges that we faced this year. And there are some policies that are outdated on the review cycle by years. And then there are some policies that are outdated on the review cycle by decades.
Wow.
So that's just real quick, kind of where we are, and I'll open it up for discussion. I wanted to be
Okay,
on
please.
Makes you wonder if the ones we haven't touched in decades are even worth keeping around anymore, if we haven't looked at them.
We got them perfect the first time.
Yeah, right.
But they still need to be reviewed according to the 3-year review cycle.
So,
I'm sorry, so how come they haven't been reviewed if it's a 3-year review cycle and here we're going on decades?
We get into a point, probably about middle of the year, where we'll have policies that'll have to be fully revised and fully prepared and implemented by a July 1st deadline, because the state says you have to have these policies in place and aligned to this. We have cases where somebody, a policy point of contact has seen that in their policies, in a block of their policies, they have titles that are outdated, or we've even had cases where policies have had website links that are outdated. So
So it is more
It
time
can-
constrained. There are 400 or so policies, I don't know what the number is.
It's a full-time job
Yeah.
to get 400 plus policies on a 3-year cycle,
On a 3-year
especially
cycle, reviewing it.
when so many things that we bring forward then go right back to the political discord that exists within the district. So many policies are written in a way that favors one political position or another, and so then each one becomes, particularly at the policy committee level, nothing goes through in 5 minutes that says that makes sense. We spent how much time on changing the title of CFO to Chief Resource Officer,
Yeah.
with allegations coming out that says, I want rubber stamp approval on everything and there is no intermediary, which was nowhere near the conversation that started in the policy committee, just that there was a misalignment of title. And so you're never gonna get, so the 3-year cycle is a good intention, but with 400 policies, that's 133.333
it is, and I think
policies a year, which is 2 per week, 2.5 per week.
So the discussion right now is how do we make this process a little bit more efficient? How can we provide the guidance for that policy committee itself going forth? What is it that we can do? I mean, even that composition of that policy committee, I looked at, I think that BDF, is it? That is what it says. I don't know how many people are there roughly on that policy committee now.
I think we're at about 16 right now.
Okay. When you look at the number of people that are represented in policy BDF that are part of that committee, I added more than 16 out there.
Yeah,
That may
there,
change.
well, we have some challenges
Yeah.
with the committee as well. I mean, it can be challenging to have an elementary school, middle school, and high school teacher present
Yep.
at our meeting.
Yeah, and then it's all of these people are attending Friday morning from 8 to 10, and it's taking away from the time that they would be in the school building itself teaching. Or this, what is it that we can propose? Is there some guidance that we can provide that policy? Because a lot of the discussions when I hear that policy committee have, it is stating that hey, what does the board want on this? What does the board want on this? And there are 2 board members sitting out there, but usually the board members are sitting in the audience and they are not part of that policy committee, so they are not chiming in. So it comes back to the board, kicks back to the board, and we need some guidance from the board. So it's like a back and forth process, and the board then looks at it and says, okay, we'll revise this, we'll send it back to the policy committee. It just seems like it is a back and forth process that takes forever to revise certain things, just a small element of the thing. What is it that we can do to make this a little bit more efficient? And Jason put together a document out there that provided overall board guidance. That came from Jason. Melissa, if you can pull that document up. I think is that something you want to talk about, Jason?
yeah, I mean, my piggyback into the, what I heard Greg mention here in this with the reverse flow is, here's how I understood, and you just let me know if I interpreted it right. So basically saying, all right, we've got all these policies, A through L. We would need somebody, potentially you or some board help to assign a point of contact for these different policies. We'll batch them into, who owns that policy really, right? What department, what director, et cetera. They're gonna give that first read, informal annual review I read, or they're gonna offer, some edits if that batch is up for review based on these principles once the board agrees upon them. From there, now the policy committee knows kind of what the board's principles are that are guiding that policy updates or revisions. Then it goes to policy committee, which has already been first read and edited, so policy committee is just gonna kind of confirm things, talk about, implications, of edits, things like that, and then it could go to board for non-action. Is that kind of how you mentioned the reverse flow of saying, hey, give the board intent first through the policy owner, or, designated person that has a say in that policy, or has expertise in that policy, then it goes policy, then board.
Yeah, and I think potentially added to that, one extra piece, that's a good flow. I think to add to that, potentially saying, here is the list or the priority we want to see these policies come. So if it's instruction and instructions on a top concern, then we take the larger instruction with Chief Acevedo, we break that down and say this person's responsible for this part, which is assessment, this person's responsible for this part, get them together with the guidance that's coming from the board that here are our general policy principles. And then when it comes to the committee can review those at that point and say, yes, this falls in line, knowing that in the end, it's still the board can still do the same when we get to the dais and say, nope, not good enough, it goes back.
But at least you'd have that first round, and you'd eliminate hopefully what President Alpacom said of just, what does the board want? Well, here's, once again, if we discuss them and agree upon them, here's what is that first scrub of revisions or updates or simplifications of policy.
So the way I look at it, and I'm just proposing this to the board as a way to navigate through this policy. At the beginning of every semester, maybe we can take it semester-wise, or if we want to take it for the whole year, at the beginning of the year in August, the board identifies, in addition to what are the policies that need to be revised by revisions in state law and legislation, those are general things that have to happen. We as a board give some type of guidance to Dr. X that this year we want to focus on all policies related to curriculum and instruction. Okay, that's our primary focus this year. But by the end of this year, we want to make sure that we have targeted all policies related to curriculum and instruction. Revising it, making sure that it's up to date and also reflects the board priorities that this board has adopted. And similarly, it could be another set of policies. I don't know, okay, but we give that direction to Dr. X, and then Dr. X, each of these policy is currently owned by a current person in the district, right? Just make sure that those people are aware that the policies are owned by them. It's their responsibility if something changes in legislation to let us know in a timely manner that a change has happened in legislation and they need to revise the policy accordingly. But when the board is asking for a revision of attendance and discipline policy or curriculum policy, you take it to that person, that primary person out there. Let them revise that policy based on this feedback that has been given to the board that Director Jurgensen has developed. Now, if the board wants to revise some language in there, so be it. That is a collective feedback that we can give. I'm just trying to work out that overall process. Based on the collective feedback, hey, we as a school board want to make student achievement a priority out here. So the policy should reflect that policy should be aligned to student achievement or student safety and staff safety in our school. Whatever it is that this board wants to put in that document, that's the lens that we want that person who is the point of contact to revise that policy. If that person has to get in 2, 3, 4 experts on that topic to bring in to revise that policy, let them be in charge of that. And then once they've revised that policy, then it goes to the policy committee. Okay, the other discussion for the board is, do we want board representation on the policy committee going forth? Okay, that's a discussion that I'm opening up to the board. In prior boards, when you go and look back, I talked to Lyman Kaiser, there was board representation on the policy committee itself. 1 or 2 board members served on the policy committee, and they are there to represent the collective interest of the board and the board priorities. Right now, we don't have that representation. Recent boards have gone away from wanting to have board members represent non-selective committees. Is that way, when there are some questions that come from that committee, we have a couple of board members on that committee that can provide feedback to that committee, and they are speaking on behalf of the entire board, more or less. That's what I'm talking about, reflecting the board values and the board priorities at this time. And then once it gets through that policy committee, it comes to the board, and we then adopt it as non-action or action. Unless it's absolutely necessary for us to send it back to the policy committee, if necessary, the board owns policies. We make the amendments that are necessary at that point in time. It's already gone through a department head, it's already gone through the policy committee, it comes to the board. If necessary, we make that amendment, and if it is only absolutely necessary, we send it back to the policy committee, otherwise we end up adopting it.
If I may, there's a thought there. If we agree on these principles and most of the stuff, I mean, you're here till 10 p.m. and we approve things that goes, oh, title change, or just that, but if there's a way for us to look at policy, so in other words, I'm adding maybe a step where it goes, okay, point of contact, the first read and edit with these guiding principles, then it comes to the board as non-action. And right there, if it's just simple name change or things like that, we can save the task of the policy committee and say, oh, it's just a title change, or it's just an update for law. Boom, right to action, and we've saved that time. Or if we go, hey, you know what, we've got some, differing opinions here on how to edit this, Dr. X, send it to the policy committee and then bring it back. So you could maybe save, you're not eliminating the policy committee, but if there's simple things that you could just update or edit, that would then take away from the task that we put on these volunteers that are, some volunteers, some are taking away from their typical duties and roles in the district. That may be something we consider as well.
Okay. So any other
I'm throwing it
thoughts?
out there, that's my personal
Any
opinion.
other thoughts on this overall process? Jason has shared some details, I've shared some details. How do you propose making this process a little bit more efficient?
One question I have is what percent takes? I mean, when I think about how many policies we've kicked back to the committee, it's really not that many.
Yeah.
I mean, it's less than 5%. And so I'm all for things moving along. And it seems to me like if it's just a title change, it really, that should be a thumbs up from the entire committee. I don't know why that would be a great big discussion. Because when it comes to us, we're like, the last couple of things we've seen you for, we're like, yeah, let's do it. And it's not even in our policy, but I think we've put it over to consensus. And I don't think that's part of our BG policy, but I wonder how many we are spending so much time on.
Oh, this year I would say probably 70%
70% what?
of our policies have taken some time. And it may not be directly going to the board and then being kicked back. It's a policy committee itself. And the minutia of even things as direct as just language, how things are phrased, and it's become work. And I think Superintendent Gall kind of hit on it. It's the policies aren't governing our work. The policies are becoming our work because we're having to edit and craft and wordsmith and double check and triple check and then get them through. I know Mr. Kaiser has a longer history on this than I do, but it's always been a case of how much do you put in the policy, how much do you leave out of the policy, and then if you put in too much, that automatically could set it up for revision. We've had a number of that. Even before the D-series policies went to the board, there was considerable discussion just about whether we should change. The same discussion that happened with the board happened in the policy committee. I can give you some really outlier examples of wedding rings being talked about as a wedding ring being a symbol of marriage, and I mean the discussion that happens, it can it can go. So, the
That's
committee.
when there's 16 of you in there.
Well, yeah, sure, but it's also, so I think Superintendent Gall also hit on the fact that when, people have beliefs and they would like to see their beliefs put into the policy.
Yeah.
Well, in the end, and I've said this to many, the policy, the only 6 beliefs that need to fit in there are the 6 members of the board.
7.
Sorry, 7, sorry. Sorry, 7, yeah, sorry.
Lauren counts still.
Or 7, and and even if you look at that and you're taking votes, then, so, there's a lot of things I think that present a challenge.
So the general thing is that we need to somehow make this process tighter and a little bit more efficient. Instead of it being laborious right now and putting the work on volunteers and committees, it's bouncing back and forth.
Yeah.
And then the committee itself is talking about their individual things that they would like to see reflected based on their experiences or whatever it is now. If it's got some merit, that's fine, but like you said, there is a reason it's adopted by the board. The board adopts the policies and owns the policies, and it's essentially coming down to us, how much, of that work we want to take on ourselves. So, first, I just want to ask the board, is there any support or any thought on a board member or 2 being part of that committee itself, so we can provide direct feedback to that committee at that level as opposed to waiting for it to come here? Is there any support for that at this time, for a board member or 2 to be part of that policy committee?
There's a strange authority differential there, where if you put a board member on the policy committee, what is the conversation going to look like when the committee is saying, well, we think X, Y, and Z, and the board member says, no, it's gotta be this?
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
I see your point.
It's the whole committee structure. Is the committee an extension of the board? And then if so, then why is the board on the committee? Because there are board members on many committees,
Yeah.
which then lead to that. Or does that ensure that the committee is going in the direction of the board? So it's who serves who. That's the open question. One, do we drive policy from the top down, or do you all drive policy? Because I enforce it. Do you drive it from the top down as a school board, or do you let it be fed from the bottom up? And that, once you answer that question, that's the same structural question to all the committees. Because we often find, and we've had this conversation a little bit at the retreat, that the staff gets verbally abused by committees because we're not doing what the committee wants us to do, but we're abiding by what is the will and direction of the board. So we have to navigate the DAC or the DAC budget subcommittee or the policy committee, or at schools at individual levels, school accountability committees, of when a SAC member doesn't approve of a direction that a USIP is going that is approved or has been approved by the Board of Education. So there's still a who serves who fundamental question that this is a test of, because the overwhelming nature of the policies to be reviewed from the bottom up says it's unsustainable. So we've seen that that's broken. And we've navigated, and I want to applaud my staff because they do most of that work, how you navigate a monthly meeting with a committee that is not connected to the desire of which way the board wants to go. And then how do you get that to the board? And then that creates discontinuity between us and the community of which we're trying to represent. So all of that, I think, needs a rehash.
I think that all of us have the wherewithal to look at the agenda, open it up, prep, create edits, get it to you or the party if it's something we deem, vital to share beforehand. I don't think you necessarily need board members on the policy committee. I would maybe recommend that we clean up the list of who's on the policy committee. If there's folks that, you could tell us of, hey, they come but they don't put, much valuable input into the committee, or they're, you know what I mean? Are there people that are contributing members of the committee, or are they just there because they have to be there? And if that's the case, are there folks that we can say, hey, we're relieving you of your responsibility to come to this committee, go do what we need you to do for the district. Or instead of having 5, of X, we only need 3 of them. If it's community member or CSEA teacher or ESP or whatever it might be, kind of bring that group down so that you have a little bit more productivity there. But my 2 takeaway points are, I don't think we need board members on the policy committee. I like the idea of the point of contact doing the first review, coming to the board, then policy committee if it needs to. And we could move a lot of policy through with these guiding principles and with the fact that we're responsible for what we were elected to do, which is, hey, if there's 5 policies coming up and they've already been taken care of by these principles and the person who owns that policy, cool, let's take a look at it, got a couple tweaks, maybe ask the policy committee for feedback on one of them, the rest of them will move to action or consent. I think that's your most efficient path forward.
Okay, so that provides, I think, what Director Carey provided and Director Jorgensen provided, the need for a board member to be on that committee itself.
So that would be committee on as-needed basis now.
I think
That's one of the suggestions that Jason has provided at this
What do
time.
you think of that?
Yeah, we will, but right now from the, feedback from 2 board members out here, unless the rest of the board has different feedback, there is not a need for a board member to serve on that policy committee itself. To reflect your point, there is some authority issue out there. My hope is that if a board member is going to serve on it, it is only to provide some overall guidance as opposed to willing the driving the narrative out there and guiding it in a different direction. But even a presence of a board member is going to make that influence that committee, then maybe we just don't need to have that board member presence. Often I've sat on that policy committee meeting and they have the discussion, and the discussion is one of the committee members says, what does the board want on this? And there are 3 board members sitting in the back out here and none of us want to talk and say, hey, this is what the board is expecting out of this. That's the reason to have a committee member on that thing, to just show that, hey, the feedback is this is what. So then it takes 2 weeks, it comes in front of the board, and then we need to send it back. That's, the value in having a board member on that committee, I think.
Or does the point of contact for that policy attend the policy committee? So if it's,
They do.
Yeah, they do, and the proposal, I think if I did hear you correctly, is that, we work with the POC, I'll use student support for this. I work with student support, we get policies lined up for attendance and behavior, and we bring the block forward. And we say, here are the suggestions we're making out of the block. We can take this one out because state law doesn't require it. We can take this one out because of CASB. They go through this using the guiding principles there, and then if you say, well, there's one here that we need some feedback on, then that one goes to the committee.
and the rest of you move on.
That's what Jason is saying.
That's what, I'm just clarifying that that's what he's saying.
Yeah,
You heard correctly, I'm making sense.
Yeah, if there is a policy that's very minor and it's like change in CFO to CRO, whatever it is, that may not need to go back to the policy committee, we can adopt it.
Yeah,
But
that's what
if
I'm
there
saying.
is a policy that requires extensive wordsmithing and is going to impact some of our stakeholders, then we do get that feedback from the policy committee. That's what Jason is suggesting, right?
Yeah.
Okay,
I mean, that seems like a good balance of
and
still
then the
getting the
other
feedback.
part of what he is,
Moving forward.
the other part of what he is suggesting is at some point in time, we need to tighten that policy committee structure itself. That if we are having so many voices in there, do we figure out,
Contributing voices.
yeah, 10 to 11, 12 voices in there, and maybe we distribute it as some amount of community members and some amount of staff members. And then all the others are experts that come into the conversation to attend one policy committee meeting and provide their expertise on that subject. If we need somebody from discipline, then they come and talk about that discipline, but they are not there at every single meeting. That's another thing. So is any other thoughts that we can provide on this whole thing?
Sorry, I'm just looking at policy BDF with the 13 members. I mean, you could cut these in half. Or, somewhat, it's from 6 teachers to maybe 4 teachers or 3 teachers, from 4 ESP to 2, from 2 exec professionals to 1, and then, I mean, you could tighten that group up pretty easily.
Time
Yeah.
planning.
So,
Yeah.
are we in agreement with what has been proposed here, first of all, that we first identify at the beginning of a semester or beginning of a school year, what are the policies that we want to target for the rest of the semester? Give that direction to Dr. X. He approaches the concerned contact person, revises that policy accordingly, and we also give a timeline in which we expect that back in front of the board. And then it comes to the board in a work session first, and we look at that policy at work session, and what policies need extensive wordsmithing or revisions goes to the policy committee. And then it comes back to the board for adoption. That's what is being proposed. In any support or thoughts or feedback that you want to provide.
Jill, did you have something you wanted to
I
say?
was just curious what Greg thought. I mean, we're talking experts here, let's hear from the experts, you're the expert.
In the end, it's refreshing. That the board is engaged in the conversation, and I'm happy that we're reviewing it. I am going to fall back on what I said, what I tried to paraphrase a little bit earlier. That when it becomes the work and isn't guiding the work, then we're using a lot of time that we could be using doing many other things. I know some of the group. When you say that we'll cut down the membership, I know if I went to some of them and said, "Hey, probably won't need you on policy committee," they'd probably hug me. They would.
Okay.
Some of them would like some of their
That's a
Friday
word.
mornings back, and you
Are
know,
teachers on this?
there are teachers that come.
It says 6
So-
teachers.
So then teachers go back in the classroom is, I think, what I overheard a little side
That was
conversation.
my little sneaky remark.
So then my comment to that is, part of Randa, what are you doing outside of the classroom for the betterment of the district? Then they don't have that opportunity.
There are other ways to contribute.
There are many other ways.
I realize that, but
And
some
right-
people
and
are pretty
right,
simple
only
for
for
that.
6
And the
people,
hardest,
not
well,
just
no,
50 teachers.
actually, we're actually down to three teachers, and our current high school teacher, because of the schedule, has not been able to attend. And one of the things the committee has not done, has taken, formal votes on whether to expel somebody from the committee for non-attendance. So, because again, the way the policies are written, it would actually have to be an act of the board to remove somebody from the committee. So I'd have to come forward and say, and this, it's a unique thing. So we're the only district that has it.
Policies on committees.
When I was trying to figure out the best way to revamp all of this quickly, I spoke to a couple of other folks in the district and other districts and explained how we do this, and talked to some other. And they kind of talked me through their process with 3 readings of a policy, and very much the same thing with. We have those who are responsible for implementing that policy at the district. They work on it, they draft it, and then they submit it to the board. So, this gives us a great opportunity if we have the guidance in bigger blocks of policy to really go through and knock a bunch of revisions out fast, not be held to this 3-year review cycle, and to really align it to CASB and say, hey, do we really still need a policy for pregnant students?
So to keep this moving along,
You could probably take that out and put it into another one, really
Maybe,
tighten it up.
right.
to keep the conversation moving along, is there an agreement that this is the way we will approach policy going forward? And what Director Hafley asked you about is, you are the expert out here, is this going to help you make the process a little bit more efficient?
I think so.
Okay, great, that's the answer I want. Then if the board is in agreement with this, the thing is that January 31st right now is circled as a day when we are going to have a board retreat, and some of the things that we didn't address in the December 20th board retreat, especially concerning what does this board want the priorities to look like going forth, what is the legacy that we want to put the stake in the ground and say this is what this board is for, and charge the superintendent with that. And with that board priorities, maybe we can focus the policies too that is going to essentially impact those board priorities first. So after that January 31st meeting, we may be able to provide guidance to Dr. X. These are the policies that we want to see between now and May being targeted by that policy committee and bring it back to us for revision, if that is okay with us.
Did you include policy BDF?
Yes, but to include policy BDF. By the end of the year, let's see if before the next year, the policy committee membership is going to come in front of the board, how that policy committee structure is going to
We
be.
can ask it to come before the board and then we can get it implemented.
Yeah, I'll have to, just to clarify, the process will change to policies going to the board for work session based on topics you're going to give me post January 31.
Yes.
Okay, so then we'll take a look at the revisions we'll have to make to BDF and to BG, which is the policy process. I can let the committee know that their role will be changing, if that's the will of the board.
Well, how much remains to be seen, right, depending on the conversation we have. So yes, it may be changing, but I don't really just guarantees. We might wanna reduce the committee, but I have to say, the representation of who we have on that committee and who is impacted by these policies, teacher voice is important, our ESP is important, parent is important. And we have some very dedicated community members and some that are newly interested. And in the end, we want support from our community for our policies. And there's not a lot of diversity on our own board. There's not as much as I'd like to see on policy committee. So I think that's something
What kind of diversity are you looking for?
people of color, for example. I mean,
We got part.
we have one,
The board,
lost two.
she's
So
talking about the policy committee.
I'm talking about both.
Okay.
We don't have a lot of diversity here, and when you look at the policy committee, there's not as much as one might want to hear. How does to Al's point, I can't really speak to the experience of young brown boys, young Hispanic
Sure.
boys. And so who's speaking up for them in like our dress code conversation?
And the only feedback that I would give in that regard is it's impossible to represent every single diverse group that is out there. Then we are going to be saying, hey, Hispanic, do we do Hispanic female, Hispanic male, to get their individual perspectives and their experience, because the perspective of a Hispanic male would be very different than a Hispanic female. And so all I'm saying is community has a voice already. When the board adopts this as non-action or action, they can always come to the board podium and give their feedback out there. They can also write to the board in
Policy says they can.
in emails and provide that feedback. We are trying to do as best as possible to put together a committee that can make this process efficient and bring this information to the board. There are ample opportunities for the community to weigh in on any policy change. We are not certainly going to stop that from happening. We want policy to reflect the values of this community, the voice of this community. That's who we represent, that's who elected us. So we will certainly
I
go through
think your
that
point
process.
is well taken, and I think it points back to making sure that we are in our schools and making sure that we're getting the pulse of what's actually happening in our schools, and making sure that our schools that we're visiting are not all of the same demographic, so that we get the other voices that we can hear, because getting diversity on any of our committees is the same thing that community engagement is spending all of their time on, is how do we bring other voices into our school district? And so we may lament whether or not we have 20 people or we have 10 people on a committee, but I think it's part of our obligation when it comes to us, is that we are reflecting what we're seeing in our schools that we're visiting, and that's one of the benefits of this board that has been instituted, and that is that we need to be connected to our schools. And I know looking at my schools, it is a spread of demographics as I look at it, as well as educational levels. So I don't think we can hold this conversation up to saying that everyone is not represented, or holding this conversation up by saying we have lots of avenues. I think as board of directors and people who are entrusted with educating all of our children, that it becomes our responsibility to be the voices of the little brown boys and the little other whoever we want to identify, so that we're doing our job to represent everybody in our district.
That's a really good point that you make.
And I would like to point out this last one. Have we ever gotten rid of any board policy in your long history? Oh, he's, Lyman is saying yes.
Yeah.
How
We
many?
have,
5?
sometimes when it becomes
More
redundant.
than that over time, but he's been repealing policies. How many did you repeal this year, right?
I've probably repealed 3 or 4 this year. But
Oh,
we've
out
had,
of 400.
but we've had to add, you know,
Yeah.
some of them we've had to add because CASB has recommended, we have one, or because state law requires that we have one. So we've added one, but yeah, a wholesale cleaning of one's whole entire section, that hasn't been done.
No.
In the time I've been on the committee or chairing it, I have not seen like a wholesale revision of it. Like taking it all and just saying, how does this match the CASB? Does this align? Does this align? Does this align? Here is a new J series for you, and here's what we've done.
Can I just follow up on that? So that's, before we see a policy, I guess I would be very interested in making sure that the staff person has reviewed it. Not that it just comes straight up to us. That they look at it, tailor it to what the legal requirements are and what they think works best for our district. And if, maybe that's a tweak to our policy, maybe that's a rewrite, and maybe they need guidance before it's a rewrite. But I don't wanna see anything raw, I don't want you to come and put the whole J series on our plate and it hasn't been updated with the latest. So I think that's what I'm hearing.
No, what I'm, just to summarize, so all of us are on the same page. The board will give you specific directions on which policy that we want reviewed or revised for that semester or the school year. And that's what will happen after the January 31st board retreat. We will come back with maybe 2 or 3 policies or group. It will fit into your timeline that what we have the rest of the school year. Maybe one set of policies that we want reviewed this school year. And that will go to the owner of that policy, and that owner will revise that policy based on input and feedback from selected people that he will reach to, people that are experts in that subject matter, including principals or legal counsel. Let them make that revision, and then it comes back to the board at a work session. Okay, and the board can look at that group of policies and say, these look good, these are minor revisions, we are comfortable with it. This requires some more work, that goes to the policy committee and returns to the board. That's what I'm understanding out here.
And just one other thought, you have policies in progress that are required by state law to change.
Yep.
We're not gonna ignore those, I assume.
No, we are not.
No,
We are not.
no,
Just
those,
checking.
those would come forward.
Anyway, okay.
So those are 2 parallel things I'm just talking about, and that's something that I do want to put on your radar, right? That at the beginning of the school year, based on the legislation that has taken place previous spring cycle, every policy owner make sure that policy aligns with the current legislation and state laws and things like those. And if changes need to be made, then they take ownership of it and revise it to make sure that it accurately reflects the current laws and stuff. And that happens too.
Yeah, I will make sure to go through and review who the POC is, and we'll make sure that that's definitely a conversation and a training piece up front. And I think you'll see some strong engagement in that every year, especially if you're not sitting back waiting for someone to remind you that it has to be.
And then by the end of the school year, look at policy BDF and also see how we can tighten that policy committee membership itself. We can bring experts into that room to provide advice, but do we need 17, 20 people as well?
I think it's a larger committee question still, which is to respect the idea of diversity of thought. Why isn't there a standard template for what every committee is supposed to have?
Yep.
A teacher or principal somebody that represents this community, somebody who represents that community, why there's 17 or 25 people on one committee and 3 on another.
Yeah.
Like, and again, the committees belong to the board. We just navigate them. And the difference between each committee is so incredibly variable that it says to me that it's not managed or directed by the board, that you all are just as reactive to the committee. The committees have become a being within themselves instead of being an extension of the board
Okay.
to be connected to the community to make sure you get that representative, diversified thought and engagement. So I don't think it's look at the committee, policy committee makeup. I think it's look at committee makeups. What is the board's position that it wants in committees? What is the charter of those committees? And how is it that you expect the district administration to navigate that? Because right now, each chief is kind of a spokesperson on each one of those larger committees. And like I said, the variability of what those exchanges are sometimes completely different than the direction and the will of the board.
Right now, we are talking to Greg and he can provide input on the policy committee. Maybe at some point in time, there is opportunities for the board to engage with the DAC and the DAC chair. And maybe that point in time, we need to talk about the composition of those committees too out there. What does the board collectively want as far as those committees go? Do we want some input on those? Instead of right now, we trying to opine on that. I wonder whether we should bring the DAC chairs and budget committees chairs and things of that nature, and then get a collective conversation going in that direction, maybe tighten some of those committees too. So, but right now, if we can start with that policy committee and looking at the whole thing. Before we move on, I'm just going to quickly recognize Lyman. Thank you for you doing the work, and I know that you wrote an email to the board on the subject matter. Anything, since you are the only community member here, I just want to make sure, and you have been a constant regular on that policy committee. Anything that you would like to provide as feedback to the board from your perspective? The discussion here, does that sound?
You probably don't want me to comment.
Okay.
I would say this, if you go the direction you're going, you need to take ownership of really knowing and understanding all of the issues that Director Ops brought up and others have brought up. You can't go into that work session cold and not know the potential ramifications. That's one. We certainly can come up, I think Greg and I have talked, with ways for changing titles and other things that are really administrative. He could come up with a list and give it to the board to review and approve. It didn't have to go through a big committee process. Another issue that you should address is the majority of the work and the discussion on the policy committee is probably on the regulations, not necessarily on the policy language itself. There have been several examples of that where we got into big issues about the language and regulation. The good news about the policy committee working that is it stays in the committee. If the board starts changing regulations and raising concerns at the dais, it's now very public, and you all saw what happened to that over the last few years. When we got into the policy committee issue in 96, 97, it was to be able to, back off and take a hard look at things that had high political impact and not overreact, number one. Number two, you want to try to keep as much of the controversial pieces out of the dais discussion if it's not necessary, but you also want to make sure that your whole system is making sure policy and regulation is aligned. When we first tackled this in 94, 5, and 6, we had a scenario where the board policies were pretty detailed throughout. The regulations were written below that at an equal level of detail, but not aligned with the policy. So that we had to go through and every one of them, and particularly instruction, to make sure that regulation and policy was aligned. And then, so make sure you have a way that you're going to do that, whether it's the policy committee or whether it's something else. And I don't know. How you get input from all the different groups is what you really have to make sure of. The idea of the board having certain issues they want to make sure are addressed could be done through board members directly to the committee. I agree with Dr. Rex, this idea of we go all the way through it and then we have the board look at it and say, well, we don't think we want to go that way. Let's send it back to the policy committee, and the policy committee says, well, what does the board want? We got to fix that. I think there's a way to do it. The other thing that you didn't talk much about was that our board very effectively amended policy that came to the board. If it was really big, then it was take it back and take another look. But if it was relatively minor, and it was a difference between the board members' philosophies, then we would require, that you completely give your amendment to the board at least 24 hours in advance, along with the rationale for why you wanted to amend the policy, and then the board discussed it, and the board made a decision to either, vote up or down on the amendment and go forward. It didn't keep bouncing back and forth. That's one way the board can make a decision and take care of a bunch of this guidance.
Okay.
It's your number one thing. I would just say that as you try it, take a hard look at whether it's working, because there's some risk.
Thanks for the feedback, and the way I see it is we are going to still lean heavily on the policy committee to provide feedback. It's not like the policy committee's work is not going to be appreciated. What I took as what Director Jurgensen brought to the table is policies that are minor revisions, that are essential changes in certain titles, things of that nature. We don't need for that to go through the policy committee before it goes to the board. I anticipate anything that requires significant amount of revisions, especially revisions to regulations and stuff like that, to be kicked back to the policy committee. Okay, and that you guys would look at it before it comes back to us. That's the way I understood what Director Jurgensen said. Is that the thing? So I still anticipate most of the policies that come in front of it, which requires extensive revisions, maybe with some board input, will go to the policy committee, and you will provide that feedback. And your other thought about board can make amendments as necessary, that's also well taken, and we will try to engage that going forward, so it doesn't kick back and forth back to the policy committee going forward. Okay, moving on. Any other further additions to this at this point in time? Okay. The document that Jason put together, if you have any revisions or suggestions to that document, do send it to me, and we can quickly look at it during that January 31st board retreat. So we are all aligned together. Okay. Last thing on the thing is, I will go through this quickly, board norms. If you pull up that document, okay, so these are the board norms. That was the first 9 things that was out there that was adapted by the previous board. I'm just going to go over each one of those things, and it's not only do we want to make any revisions, but also let the new board members know that these are the expected norms, but also a reminder for even the current board members, because some of us have not been, to some extent, being diligent in respecting these board norms. These were the 9 norms that was adopted by the previous board. If you want to change any in that, please do. And as I go with each one of them, I will share my thoughts on it. And if any other board members want to chime in, you can also do that. Be respectful. The first board norm, that is the expectation that when we conduct business from the board dais, we as board members respect community members that come to the board podium and talk, and we also respect other board members. That has to some extent fallen away in the last year or so. Whether that is even in public, when we are talking to community members, that we are always thoughtful and respectful for how we engage with them, knowing that you are representing the entire board, even through emails, if you want to go about doing that. Often we as board members, it's my experience that we are put in difficult situation. People approach us being sarcastic or antagonistic, trying to provoke us to make some comments, and we just always have to make sure that we are thoughtful in our response back to them. Just understand that your response is going to get publicity. The person that comes and says something to you, they are not going to be the object of attention. They are going to quickly fall away. But your response is going to get the attention. So be always aware that what you put on emails, text messages, things of that nature, but that when you use D11 resources, that all can be quoted, can be available. So just be careful how you respond back. We don't want to use offensive or questionable language when we are at the board dais. We don't want to label any group of individuals with a collective name or anything like that. All of that is addressed in the board operating manual too. Response to public comments is another thing. How do we go about doing it? And this is something that I can use some board feedback on. Sometimes you have community members that collectively come or they come to the board podium and take a certain board member to task by calling them specific names or alleging something to them. Maybe it's hypothetical, but then what that puts us, the board member is then put in a situation where they feel compelled to respond back when their board report comes up. We as a board do not usually respond back to public comments directly when the public makes that comment, but if somebody comes and calls me a bigot or me a racist, I'm just talking about myself, then is that something that I need to address in my board member report? Other board members in the past have said, like, when they are being called a bigot or a racist, it's my job as the board president to gavel that and stop that public comment from taking place. And if I don't stop it, then they feel like they are compelled to respond back in the board member report when they are called names like that out there. But that's the public comment part of itself. How do we address public comments? Any thoughts or additions that you guys want to do for that thing?
You just leave public comments like wide open so anybody can talk about anything, or do you have a guidance for, here's the topic, what you can talk about tonight, and that's it.
Yeah, there is action agenda items, there is non-action agenda items, but then there are general comments. The general comments is anything pertaining to public education that they can come and talk. We often say that you don't bring a personal issue to the board podium. Personal issue means don't come and talk about a staff member, specifically go to the superintendent and talk. But we are non-staff members, so if they come and attack or say something that is, derogatory about a board member, we are public servants. Do we let that go? If they come and say something about the superintendent, he is a public employee and he sits on the board dais out there. So do we let that go, and how much is it that I can gavel out there to stop that from happening? We want the conversation to be more about the overall subject matter, the priorities, how that impacts, as opposed to individual attacks on a specific board member it doesn't achieve anything other than it gives them the podium out there to come and attack a board member and talk about it. And some of it is, controlled by the freedom of right to speech and, how much we can gavel that. If they say something that is rude, that is completely offensive, calling, using offensive language, then I can gavel that, saying that that's unacceptable.
I think your guidelines is the decorum of the meeting in which you run.
Yeah.
If it's, Robert's Rules of Order and parliamentary proceedings, then there is a certain decorum that we want to maintain in the boardroom. And if it's, I've got strong feelings against Director Jorgensen's thoughts or actions or words, great, I'll hear them. But if it derails into things that are not aligned with the decorum of the boardroom that you want to run as president, then I think that's where you gavel and say, this isn't aligned with the decorum we want to maintain in this.
So keep it to the subject matter, say that, hey, if you disagree with something, but when they resort to name calling or something like that, maybe that's when I can.
Yeah. Just refer to the decorum of the boardroom that we conduct meetings with.
Okay, so anything else that you would add?
People have a First Amendment right, and we live in a litigious society, and from all directions, whether you want to say political spectrum or whatever, people, if we have public comment, they can come and they can speak about personnel. They can call us names. They can put it to music, do it with poetry, that avoids your decorum commentary. We give people the right to come and speak to us. I think maybe we could change up our policy a little to allow that if a board member, I don't want to say feels attacked, because some people have thin skins, but if they, if it's really out of bounds, I think it's fair to have a board member respond during board reports.
Okay.
And
Okay,
yeah.
but the question becomes, one of the things that is happening right now in public board meetings, if you've been following what's been happening in surrounding district, is we have community members coming and reading specific paragraphs from books that are found in public libraries, and they are coming and this goes into great sexual language out there. So if they are going to be talking about that out there, I've already reached out to legal counsel and say, what is it that I can do in this regard? Now you can say that's freedom of public speech. Then it becomes like, kids could be there in this thing or watching it. Do we allow all that reading that they just read from book after book and say, hey, this is there in your
What was the
school
legal response to
what's
that question?
She's going to get back to me. She said that she will look into it and get back to me on that. She, D20 had that problem, and their board president gavelled that person when they started reading offensive language from the book, because this is explicit sexual language when we are talking
I
about.
think that proves their point.
Yeah, well, I
If
know.
you can't read it at the dais, it shouldn't be in libraries.
Yeah, exactly.
But there's a policy for that.
Right.
There's a policy for that. If there are books that have explicit language that people are not comfortable with, there is a policy to bring that forward that doesn't have to derail a public the business meaning of the Board of Education. So I also think the board needs to decide, do they want public comment to be a First Amendment opportunity, or is it a commentary on the agenda of the business meeting? You can still provide both by saying, we prioritize action items first, non-action items second, and then general comments are reserved for the last 30 minutes of the meeting.
Yeah,
And if
push it to the
somebody
end.
really wants to exercise that right, they have the right to exercise it. But we last year teetered on losing the ability to run the district because people wanted to express public positions on items that weren't even up for vote or action. There was, remember, D20 has a gender pronoun policy. District 20 has a staff conduct policy, of which there was a policy recommendation to include whether or not pronouns would exist within the things that we thought were allowable or not allowable. We defaulted into a space that didn't go into a gender pronoun policy. Yet we were hijacked for weeks, and individual board members were called homophobic, were called things that were not what they were proposing. They were proposing to find the middle ground of how is it, because we had students represent both sides of this issue. But because we don't curtail public comment, I saw it happen on a couple initiatives. A single voice paralyzes 23,000 kids because they get 3 minutes of non-responded comments of which everybody goes, wow. Now, they didn't win a board position. They aren't staff members. They haven't run it through a committee or followed one of our policies of how to change those things. They just have to come up and say whatever it is, the thing that they don't like. And so if somebody comes up and reads that, the gavel should come down and say, policy XYZ addresses your dissatisfaction with books that we have. Please follow that policy, of which the board will then act with full intention.
Right.
But-
I
but-
just want to make sure I'm not in violation of the First Amendment then.
You're not in
And then
violation of First Amendment if you just structure your meeting to prioritize the work of this district. We're almost there. We're almost to the place that we celebrate students and staff and community for the first hour or so, and then we quickly get through public comment and to the actions of the board.
And
By-
I want to follow up on that. So you're dredging up this memory that is traumatic for me, and I don't know how else to say it. So after the Club Q shooting, and we had during public comment, somebody came up and stood at the dais, stood at the microphone and pointed out a board member and used his fingers to replicate a gun and bang. I will never get over that.
Right.
It was awful, and I'm still traumatized by it. There's a point at which First Amendment rights has to take into consideration, at least in our environment, take into consideration the purpose of it. And I have to say, I'm not sure I was a contributing member of this board of directors after that public comment. It was traumatic.
Right.
And it got in the way of conducting business for me. So
Yeah,
if
something
we
to
move
the, yeah.
if we
what-
move it to a different place, if someone's really committed to it, then I'm gonna listen to it. But the expectation for myself is that I'm not gonna be
Threatened?
required, no, that's a different person who came to the dais, or the microphone. I'm not gonna be required to be an attentive board of directors conducting business afterwards. And if we can limit it, that would be great.
Okay.
Thank you for
So let
letting
me
say.
take that advice from legal counsel too. So I'm going to, as usual, I read a bunch of things at the very top to keep it professional, don't resort to public attacks and attacks against specific board members, talk about the issue itself as opposed to pointing the finger at somebody out there, all those things, but people sometimes.
You read the disclosure, I mean, the board is conducting board business this
Yep.
evening, and we're, trying to focus on the needs of the district, and so maybe it is, hey, action and non-action, and maybe it's, before non-action is non-action comments, before action is what we used to have,
We
right?
used to have.
Yeah, it is, action comments, and then, cause how many times do we have people come up and yell at somebody or something, and then walk off, and it's like, you didn't see any of the actual work we've done, nor do you know any of the things that our team is actually doing to correct your
They're not
concern.
even willing to listen to the board
Right.
response, a board member report or anything of that nature.
So
They
maybe it
made
is
their
adjusting
point and they
when
walk
public
out.
comment is.
And sometimes we stop a child in the middle of a presentation to meet our 6 o'clock mandate for public comment on action items. So we're super tight on that one rule, but we're not willing to impose other rules that actually say, you know what, can I ask if you're willing to delay your public comment on this action item until we finish this student presentation of our school spotlight? I guarantee you, anybody who's sitting here would be happy to do that. But we escort kids to sit down and then we bring them back up again and they're like, what's the priority here? And so if the priority,
The law.
It's legally required,
Yeah,
at 6 o'clock,
maybe not 6, but
Well,
did you
but
post
what
it
time
tonight?
we announce?
right? So we could probably post a range or say immediately following school spotlight or program spotlight. There are other ways that we can own things. So I always just find it interesting that we always want to be rule followers, but then we're never willing to adjust the rules that allow us to get the work done that we need to get done. I'm not against general comment, but I was really confused when a city council member came forward and told us what he thought our position should be on the marijuana vote that was coming up last November. And I was like, what? And I went through the agenda, because I'd only been here a month or two, and I was like, are we talking about that today? Is it our legislative? And I was like, oh wait, we just allow anybody to comment on anything we want to.
Yeah.
Now people will be creative. When I was in Oakland, you had a 2-minute limit for general comment. And so we had a guy that would sign up for like 6 different comments, and he would read his manifesto 2 minutes at a time. And he would introduce each one of them with some connection to get him there to be able to read it. And so then A for effort for him, that he was that dedicated to get his manifesto. But I think the work of the board, this goes back to the board communication strategy. The work of the board in the district has to be paramount to what we do. The community gets a chance to vote every 2 years on the direction that it wants its board to do. Why we feel this need to have to be validated every public comment on whether or not we're doing the right thing on behalf of the district, on behalf of the community, is confusing to me, especially when there are multiple ways for them to express their dissatisfaction.
Or
Or
satisfaction.
Or satisfaction.
I think about how many people have come to fawn over the board in the last 2 years, I'm like, just,
Right, so it could play the other way. If it's not on agenda, action or non-action item, then it's just not worth our time up front. If you want to tell me at the end of the day that you don't like my letter to somebody or you did like our decision, that's great. Because then we're politicking public comment.
This
The
feels
vice president have the ability to move the agenda around.
well, but I think that is something in our board
Operating.
handbook, and I think it's a board decision. And my concern is, we have students come and show up to tell us their opinions on snow day, and we're gonna keep them until midnight,
I think we should always prioritize student voice, and I think we're finding ways to do that, right? But again, it's interesting when you think about how that snow day event played out, right? So students run their own survey that isn't actually tested through our data analytics shop, and then bring information forward of which we had already made the decision that we weren't going to implement remote learning days. And we took advantage of the opportunity that students brought it forward for students to be able to express their inputs on those decisions. What we've decided is we need more student input on our large decisions. So that's come from the CASB conversation from the 12-13 board meeting when the students made that presentation. How do we get students on committees, or how do we get a non-voting student member on the dais to be able to influence the decisions of the school district instead of feeling that it's on them? Because there's also a survey out right now on the common block decision of the school district, that the students don't like the common block, so they're going to run a survey. Now that also happens to be a grievable item, well, according to the master agreement with CSEA. So we're going to be taking that to arbitration next week or the week after, and students are running a survey that didn't meet the rigor of what any real survey would if you actually wanted to analyze that question. Now, we love when students come forward, and I appreciate the teachers who have been in that space to help facilitate, and the staff that have been helped to facilitate that conversation. But the district is not gonna make its decision on if students saying they do or do not like that decision of the district. It's a much more complicated decision than that.
To me, this feels hard to judge without the legal guidance. You know, there are some constraints that we impose already. We impose a time limit. You have the boilerplate at the beginning that kind of addresses the tone and the direction that public comment is expected to take, whether or not we always enforce that. So there are constraints that we do put in, but there's also a sense in which, as a public institution, I'm sure there are requirements that we allow the public to speak. I don't know exactly what those requirements are. As Director Ott mentioned, there are First Amendment rights to be considered as well. This just feels like a hard conversation to have in the absence of the specific legal principles that we're operating under.
Let me get that feedback from legal counsel, and then as far as what Superintendent Gall talked about, moving the general comments to the back end of the meeting and just having action and non-action comments at the front of the meeting. That's something that the board can consider at the end of this year for revision of the board operating manual. And as we move into the next school year, if that is how we want to proceed going forward, that way we have the action and non-action in the front and all the general comments that come at the back end of the meeting. Some school districts do that, and maybe then that requires an investment from the community members to stay till the end of the meeting to provide that feedback. So if they have that invested, that's a conversation we can take place up there. And I will bring that feedback from legal counsel with the rest of it. But the general overall perspective is that I will read that language, and if they, in my, sometimes that's what becomes really difficult for me when I'm sitting there at the board dais and I've got to make that judgment in the spur of the moment that, hey, this is, I'm going to gavel. And once I gavel this, then I got to hold the same standard for the next thing. If I don't do that, then they come and call me out and say, you gavel this person and you didn't gavel me, or whatever it is. You know, it just becomes this. So I will get this, but in the meantime, the general feedback is just always be respectful, understand your position, be careful about what you post on social media if you are on social media, because you're always being watched, and anything that you say is going to be a bigger deal as compared to what they are going to come and say to you. Anything else that anybody want to add in that? Be respectful, be succinct. I know that we have 2 long board meetings out there, you know, this is a question of how we can reduce sometimes the length of the board meetings. So all our staff can also go home at a reasonable amount of time. So whatever that you can do to be to the point out there in a board meeting, and then maybe there are other questions that you want to know about a specific program. If it is a dyslexia program and you want to know about it, instead of asking about it specifically in the board dais, maybe you can direct the question to the superintendent and they can provide that feedback out there. Any way that we can keep the conversation succinct at the board dais would help out in keeping shorter meetings. Even the board reports, we got to be careful about that. The board operating manual says specifically 3 minutes. Maybe if we need to extend it by a minute or so, I'm not going to gavel you out there, but let's keep it within that. And I am the culprit in this myself. I will point the finger at myself. But other board members have also taken leeway of it, and some of your board reports have gone longer than it is. But if we can keep ours limited to about 4 minutes or so, less than that, and go about doing that. Anything else that will help you to achieve this goals or this board norm of being succinct? Anything that I can or the administration can provide you as far as information for you to be helpful?
I think it goes back to being prepared for the meetings, which is number 9 there. You
Okay.
know,
And
not waiting until somebody's in front of you and you're asking a question that potentially, if you had done your review or your preview, you could have answered that question yourself,
Yep.
right?
And maybe, with Jill, when I'm setting the agenda, we can set a time for each one of the board agenda item. This is going to be a 30-minute conversation, and then we ask Superintendent Gall, 15 minutes of it is going to be presentation, 15 minutes of it is going to be questions, and we, as far as possible, stick to that time constraint down there, 30 or 35 minutes. And if we need more information, if it's an action agenda item, we need more information, so be it, but we stick to that time limit as much as possible. And that feedback I will also share with Superintendent Gall, that his administrative team also makes their presentation in a tight manner going forward. Third thing, start on time. Punctuality is really important. I think as we go along, my thought process of this is, if I'm there, I'm going to start the board meeting on time. If I'm not there, Jill, please make sure you start the board meeting on time. And if you guys are 5-10 minutes late, you guys come and join the meeting as it is in progress. Sometimes we are waiting around for board members to come and join us, and I'm just going to value all the time and as much as possible start the board meeting on time. Punctual, no surprises. This comes to the fourth one, that if there is going to be an item that is going to be adopted from the board, and you are going to revise this as a single board member, just keep the board informed about it so we are not caught by surprise. So board members are aware of things that you can pull out things from consent as an individual board member if you so desire. So for example, personnel recommendations come in front as a consent item. You as a board member can pull that personnel recommendation from consent to action because you are not in support of one personnel who is being hired or whatever it is that is being out there. But if you are doing that, keep the board informed so we are not caught by surprise out there. Just give the board advance notice 24 hours in advance that you are going to make that amendment, you are going to change that out there. If you as an individual board member are going to be talking to the media, the expectation is that you would let the board know. You are not representing and talking for the board. Usually that responsibility the board has assigned to the board president, that if the board president is talking on behalf of the board. But if the secretary to the Board of Education also talks on behalf of the board in responding back to emails and stuff. But if you are talking to the media, keep the rest of us informed that you have talked to the board as an individual board member, so we are aware that you did. Anything in this that you guys want to share, or can I keep going? Okay, accept board decisions with honor, and this is again unified voice of the board, and I think the board operating manual says the board members will support verbally and non-verbally the majority decision of the board. If dissenting, explain your position on that issue as an individual. You are not talking on behalf of the board. So whether you voted for that issue or whether you voted against that issue, after the decision has been made, accept that board decision with honor, and we want to communicate that we are a unified body out there. Govern with that best available information. So what available facts that you have, every attempt will be made by the district to provide you with all the information necessary to make that decision. You can ask for clarity, you can ask for additional information if necessary, but the expectation is with the available facts that you will make the best possible decision out there. Obviously, without saying it, without me saying it, you are expected to use your best judgment in this. You are not influenced by outside groups or special interest groups or anything like that while making that decision. Weigh all the available information and you make the decision that best settles with you or reflects your conscience and your after weighing all that information. Presume goodwill. Not our job or to question motive or intent of other board members. We are going to assume that all board members come to the board dais with the best intent that they are going to support the board priorities, and if they voted against it, so be it. But the majority of the board, all of us are here to improve the educational experience of our students and families. So just presume goodwill. Okay, the only thing that I would add is that there is not an expectation that outside this boardroom, the 7 of us should be friends or anything like that. But inside this boardroom, the expectation is that we will collectively work together and respect each other and not just
Stonewall.
yes, yeah, just not even engage with anybody. I mean, it has happened with my time on the board where board members have completely disengaged with other board members and don't want to engage with them. So the expectation is we are a collective body. We have to work together to bring the best decisions that will support the superintendent and the school district. Outside the boardroom, you don't need to be friends, but inside we at least have to communicate and respect each other in a respectful manner. Act with integrity.
Can I ask a quick just preference decorum question? When watching board meetings online in the preceding months, there were a number of times where I would see board members bring up something a previous board member had said or did. I don't know if this was part of the expected decorum or just the way people did it, but invariably what happened is the previous sayings or the previous decisions were kind of hinted at, never actually said outright. And a few board members would then call out and say, well, actually, that was me, I did that, and I did that for this reason. So what do we have any expectations if you want to bring up a disagreement with a previous board member? Is there an expectation as to how that ought to be said out loud or how that ought to be handled?
If it's voted on, you should accept it and let it be. And if there's an issue personally, then I think you would just go to that director personally.
This would be a better question if I had a specific example in mind.
Okay.
Yeah, okay. I'll punt for now.
Well, even without a specific example, the hopeful expectation is that once that decision has been made and that has gone by, we just accept that as goodwill. We can communicate that as a factual information, just the way we sometimes communicate that from the board dais. Are we doing that intentionally to put that board member in a negative spotlight, or are we doing that just as providing a factual information? As a matter of fact, there is a way that we can handle ourselves better going forward. And this is a constant reminder that, hey, these are the board norms, which the previous board at some times was not in alignment with, and we didn't follow a lot of these. All of us are guilty of that, and that's why it's a reminder that we, going forward, do not, when we say presume goodwill, we are going to assume that all board members did due diligence, did the due research, and they explained themselves at the board dais when they supported or voted against that measure, and it's public record. We don't need to point out that this board member did that or that. That's where I would leave it at that. And if you have disagreement, you can individually talk with that board member as opposed to bringing that up. Act with integrity. Conflict of interest comes up, things of that nature. Be careful about that. You do not put yourself in situations where your integrity is going to be questioned. This I've already talked about. Be careful about your interaction with other employees, how you conduct yourself out there. The superintendent is our one employee. We go through the superintendent and he directs the work towards other employees. You have, the expectation is that if you have some questions, you can go directly to the chief. So you can go to Dr. Comfort and ask a question about the MLO, levy certification, things of that nature, or something related to the budget, but you always keep the superintendent informed that you are going and talking to, or you can talk to the chief's level, but you don't go below him and talk to his somebody out there in his office or whatever it is or anything. So keep him informed. Now, once you go to him, he may say to you that, hey, this is a subject matter that you want to go and talk to so-and-so in my department. That's him providing you that direction and thing to go and talk, and after that you can go and talk to him. Be prepared, read all the materials as far as possible. Everything is going to be posted on Friday before the Wednesday board meeting so that you will have the weekend time to at least prepare and digest that information. Other than what is there in superintendent's report, that is the only thing that doesn't get posted. And usually the items that are there in the superintendent report are talking about things that he's giving kudos to a specific teacher, things of that nature, and that's something that we can don't need advance. So he's advanced notice on, but everything else, the expectation that I have communicated to the superintendent also is that by Friday evening, those are all going to be attached to board docs, so you will have some time to prepare for it over the weekend and be ready for it on the Wednesday meeting. That's essentially the summary of the board norms. Is there anything that is missing in that this board would like to add, or are you comfortable with that, or revising any of that language out there? As I said, I think we did an exercise 2 years back with the previous board in developing this board norms. I don't want to start that process all over again. We have this document, and we can see if there is anything you want to add to it, but otherwise those are the basic expectations. And then if you pull the page a little bit down, Melissa, and these are some of the things that are on board docs when you go and look at the board meeting and stuff like that: board purpose, essential board goals, board focus areas, and board core values. I think we had a email from Mr. Kaiser asking that we include accountability as one of the board core values. If the board is comfortable adding that language out there, we can add that to the board core values.
We've shown that with our goals we have this year,
Okay,
so we want
Is
to be
that-
accountable.
is that something that we are alignment with this? Put board core values, accountability? Okay. So let's add that accountability to that board core values. I'm just trying to recall, there was a second thing that you had asked.
Integrity. would that be-
Oh, integrity, that was the other thing that you had asked. Is that already in that language?
Well, it's in the meeting norms,
Yeah.
so it,
Okay,
I think it could be in core values as well.
okay. If the board is comfortable with that, we can add both integrity and accountability in the board core values.
As opposed to values, could we change it to virtues?
I like values.
It's a lost word.
Okay. I'm comfortable. Yeah. But are you good with adding accountability and integrity to the board core values? Okay, great. So we'll add those two, and then those are the board norms. Any further discussion of this subject matter?
No.
Thank you so much. Okay, with that, we will have, like I said, a board retreat on January 31st. At that time, some of the things that didn't get addressed in that December 20th meeting, it will be mainly a time for the board to talk. At that time, you may still get that one-on-one engagement with George Welch, because he reached out to Melissa Olson. Is there value in having that one-on-one conversation?
Well, we delegated some things to him to take care of with us, so yes, there is value.
Okay. One of the things was the board's mid-year evaluation of the superintendent. And there was some feedback about that from board members that they would prefer not going through George to provide that feedback, that this should be a collective board discussion. So my suggestion was that if we can have an executive session next week for about 45 minutes or so, and then the 7 board members talk about ourselves, what is it, that feedback that we want to take to the superintendent, and we capture that and then take it back to the superintendent. Is that okay? Superintendent does not need to be present at that executive session. Okay,
Sure.
great. Okay, we gather that that's what that executive session will be for next week. So you don't need to provide that feedback directly to George Welsh, but have that collective group discussion. You good with that? Yes, great. Okay, with that, we are officially adjourned at 9:08. Anything else for the best interest of? No. Okay, thank you guys.
Too late, you adjourned the meeting.